Welcome to Sleepless History, where we explore the past in a calm, gentle way, perfect for helping you drift off to sleep. Tonight, we're journeying back thousands of years to ancient Greece, a civilization that emerged from the mists of time to shape the world we know today. Over the next 2 hours, we'll explore the long, winding story of this remarkable culture, from its earliest beginnings through its golden age and beyond. Greece is a land of mountains and islands, of olive groves and rocky shores where the Mediterranean Sea laps against ancient stones. It's a place where myths and history intertwine, where gods walked among mortals and where human achievement reached heights that still inspire us today. But before there were philosophers debating in the Agora, before there were marble temples gleaming on hilltops, there were simply people trying to survive, to build communities, and to make sense of their world. Let's begin our journey in the deep past, long before anyone called themselves Greek, in a time when the first farmers were settling the land and creating the foundations of what would become one of history's most influential civilizations. The early Bronze Age, the dawn of civilization. Our story begins around 3100 BC in what historians call the early Bronze Age. The Greek peninsula at this time was home to small farming communities, people who had learned to cultivate wheat and barley, to raise sheep and goats, and to make simple pottery. These weren't the Greeks as we know them yet. They were the ancestors, the people who would lay the groundwork for everything that came after. Life in these early settlements was simple and focused on survival. Families lived in small, rectangular houses made of mud, brick and stone, with thatched roofs to keep out the rain. The houses were typically 1 or 2 rooms, with a central hearth for cooking and warmth. There were no windows, just a door, and perhaps a hole in the roof to let out smoke. People slept on the floor, on simple bedding made of woven reeds or animal skins. During the day, men would tend to the fields or watch over flocks of animals in the hills. Women would grind grain, weave cloth, make pottery, and prepare food. Children would help with lighter tasks, learning the skills they would need as adults. It was a communal life where everyone in the village knew everyone else, and survival depended on cooperation. The villages were small, perhaps 50 to 100 people at most. They were built near sources of fresh water, usually a spring or a stream. The surrounding land would be divided into fields where crops were grown in the spring and summer and left fallow in other seasons. Beyond the fields, there were pastures for animals, and beyond that, the wild hills and forests where people might hunt deer or wild boar. These early people had beliefs and rituals, though we can only guess at what they were. They buried their dead with care, sometimes placing pottery vessels or simple tools in the graves, suggesting they believed in some kind of afterlife. Small figurines, usually of women with exaggerated features, have been found at various sites. These might have been fertility symbols, representations of goddesses, or simply toys. We cannot know for certain. Trade was beginning to develop during this period. People would exchange goods with neighbouring villages, trading surplus grain for pottery or wool for obsidian, a volcanic glass used to make sharp cutting tools. Some items came from farther away, suggesting that networks of trade were starting to extend across the region. By 2500 BC, these communities were growing and becoming more complex. Some settlements were becoming larger than others, developing into small towns. Leaders were emerging, individuals who could organize labor, settle disputes, and represent the community in dealings with outsiders. These weren't kings or tyrants yet, but respected elders or skilled individuals who had earned the trust of their neighbors. The dead were increasingly being buried in communal tombs, large stone structures where multiple bodies would be laid to rest over generations. This suggests a growing sense of family lineage and community identity. People were starting to think of themselves as part of something larger than just their immediate household. During this time, metalworking was becoming more sophisticated. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, was being used to make tools and weapons. Bronze was harder and more durable than copper alone, and it could be sharpened to a fine edge. The ability to work bronze was a valuable skill, and smiths were respected members of their communities. A good bronze axe or spear point could mean the difference between a successful hunt and going hungry, between defending your village and being overrun by raiders. The early Bronze Age was a time of gradual change, of communities slowly growing and developing. It wasn't dramatic or exciting in the way we often think of history. There were no great battles or famous leaders, no monuments that have survived to awe us, but it was foundational. These were the centuries when people learned to live together in larger groups, to specialize in different crafts, to trade with distant communities, and to develop the social structures that would support more complex civilizations. The Minoans, Europe's first great civilization. Around 2000 BC, something remarkable was happening on the island of Crete, the large island south of the Greek mainland. A sophisticated civilization was emerging, one that would become the first great culture in Europe. We call these people the Minoans, named after the legendary King Minos, though they never called themselves by that name. Their own name for themselves has been lost to time. The Minoans built palaces, grand structures that served as administrative centres, religious sites, and residences for the elite. The most famous of these is Knossos, a sprawling complex of rooms, corridors, and courtyards that covered several acres. Walking through Knossos would have been a bewildering experience. The palace had multiple stories, connected by staircases. There were hundreds of rooms, some large and ceremonial, others small and utilitarian. The walls were decorated with vibrant frescoes, showing scenes of nature, religious rituals, and daily life. These frescoes give us glimpses into Minoan culture. We see young men leaping over bulls in what appears to be a religious ceremony or sport. We see women in elaborate dresses with tight bodices and flounced skirts, their hair carefully styled. We see dolphins swimming in azure seas, and griffins, mythical creatures with the body of a lion and the head and wings of an eagle. The Minoans loved colour and beauty, and they surrounded themselves with art. The Minoan economy was complex and far-reaching. The palaces served as centres of production and distribution. Workshops at Knossos produced pottery, textiles, bronze objects, and luxury goods. The palace controlled large agricultural estates, where farmers grew olives, grapes, grain, and legumes. They raised sheep for wool and cattle for meat and dairy products. The Minoans were great seafarers and traders. Their ships sailed throughout the Mediterranean, carrying Cretan goods to Egypt, the Near East, and the islands of the Aegean. They traded olive oil, wine, fine pottery, and textiles for metals, precious stones, and exotic goods. Minoan pottery has been found in Egypt, and Egyptian objects have been found in Crete, showing that these two civilizations were in regular contact. Life in Minoan Crete seems to have been relatively peaceful, at least for several centuries. Unlike many ancient cities, Minoan palaces weren't heavily fortified. They didn't have massive walls or defensive towers. This suggests either that the Minoans felt secure, perhaps protected by their fleet, or that warfare wasn't as central to their culture as it was to others. The Minoans had a writing system, though we haven't fully deciphered it. The earliest script, called Cretan hieroglyphic, used pictorial symbols. Later, they developed Linear A, a script of lines and geometric shapes. Thousands of clay tablets inscribed with Linear A have been found, mostly recording economic transactions, lists of goods, and administrative records. But we still don't understand the language they wrote in, so these tablets remain mysterious, tantalizing hints of a culture we can't fully access. Religion seems to have been central to Minoan life. Many of their rituals appear to have been conducted outdoors, on mountaintops or in sacred caves. The bull was an important religious symbol, as were snakes, birds, and certain types of trees. Female figures, possibly priestesses or goddesses, appear frequently in Minoan art. Some scholars believe the Minoans worshipped a great mother goddess, though this is debated. One of the most intriguing aspects of Minoan culture is the apparent prominence of women. Many of the figures shown presiding over religious ceremonies are female. Women are depicted in frescoes, engaging in what appear to be important social activities, not just domestic work. Some scholars have suggested that Minoan society might have been more gender egalitarian than many ancient cultures, or even matriarchal, though this is controversial and difficult to prove. Daily life for ordinary Minoans was centered around farming and craft production. Most people lived in towns and villages rather than in the palaces themselves. Houses were typically built of stone and mud brick, with flat roofs. They might have multiple rooms, including living areas, storage rooms, and workshops. Families would have furniture, storage jars, cooking equipment, and personal items like jewelry and cosmetics. Food was an important part of Minoan culture. They ate bread made from wheat or barley, seasoned with herbs. They consumed lots of olive oil, which they used for cooking, lighting lamps, and personal care. They grew grapes and made wine. From the sea, they caught fish and gathered shellfish. They kept bees for honey, which was their main sweetener. Meat was probably eaten less frequently, reserved for festivals and special occasions. The Minoans made beautiful pottery. In the early period, they made camaraes ware, pottery with dark backgrounds and light-coloured decorations of abstract patterns and natural motifs. Later, they developed the marine style, pottery decorated with octopuses, fish, and shells, celebrating their connection to the sea. They also made stone vessels, carved from various types of stone into elegant shapes. Around 1700 BC, disaster struck. A massive volcanic eruption occurred on the island of Thera, modern-day Santorini, about 70 miles north of Crete. The eruption was one of the largest in human history, far more powerful than the eruption of Mount Vesuvius that destroyed Pompeii. It blasted an enormous amount of ash into the atmosphere, triggered massive tsunamis, and may have caused climate disruption across the region. The effects on Crete were devastating. Coastal settlements were destroyed by tsunamis. Ash fell across the island, ruining crops. The eruption may have weakened Minoan civilization, making it vulnerable to outside forces. Archaeological evidence shows that many Minoan sites were destroyed or damaged around this time, though whether this was due to the eruption, earthquakes, or human invasion is debated. After the eruption, Minoan civilization continued, but it was never quite the same. The palaces were rebuilt, but the culture was changing. There's evidence of increasing influence from mainland Greece, from people we call the Mycenaeans. Eventually, the Mycenaeans would come to dominate Crete, and the distinctive Minoan culture would fade, absorbed into the broader Greek world. But the Minoans left a lasting legacy. They influenced the Mycenaeans who came after them, and through the Mycenaeans, they influenced classical Greek culture. Some Greek myths may have their origins in Minoan stories. The legend of the Minotaur, a creature half man and half bull kept in a labyrinth at Knossos, might be a dim memory of Minoan bull rituals and the maze-like palace. The Minoans showed what was possible in the Aegean world, creating a sophisticated, artistic, wealthy civilization that would inspire those who came after. The Mycenaeans, warriors and palace kings. While the Minoans were flourishing on Crete, developments were occurring on the Greek mainland. Around 1600 BC, a new culture was emerging, one that we call Mycenaean, named after Mycenae, one of its major centres. The Mycenaeans were different from the Minoans in important ways. They were more warlike, more hierarchical, and more focused on fortification and defence. The Mycenaeans built their palaces on hilltops and surrounded them with massive walls made of enormous stones. These Cyclopean walls, as they're called, were so impressive that later Greeks believed they must have been built by giants. The Lion Gate at Mycenae, with its carved lions flanking the entrance, still stands today, a testament to Mycenaean engineering and artistry. Mycenaean palaces were smaller than Minoan ones, but they were centres of power nonetheless. The heart of a Mycenaean palace was the Megaron, a large rectangular hall with a central hearth and a throne for the ruler. This is where the king, whom the Mycenaeans called the Warnax, would sit, surrounded by his warriors and nobles, making decisions, hearing disputes, and hosting feasts. The Mycenaean world was divided into kingdoms, each ruled by its own Wainax. Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, Thebes, and Athens were among the major centres. These kingdoms seem to have been independent but culturally related, speaking the same language and sharing similar customs and beliefs. Sometimes they cooperated, sometimes they competed, and sometimes they fought. The Mycenaeans were warriors. Warfare and military prowess were central to their culture and identity. The elite were buried with weapons, armour, and gold. They fought with bronze swords, spears, and daggers. They used bows and arrows. Some warriors fought from chariots, a prestigious and expensive form of warfare that required not just a chariot, but also trained horses and a skilled driver. Mycenaean armour included bronze breastplates, helmets, and sometimes greaves to protect the legs. They carried large shields, either figure-eight-shaped or tower-shaped, made of layers of leather stretched over a wooden frame, sometimes reinforced with bronze. A fully equipped Mycenaean warrior was a formidable sight, gleaming with bronze and ready for battle. But the Mycenaeans weren't just warriors, they were also traders and craftsmen. They traded throughout the Mediterranean, their pottery found in Italy, Egypt, and the Near East. They established trading posts and may have controlled parts of the coast of Asia Minor. They were influenced by the Minoans and adopted many aspects of Minoan culture, including artistic styles and perhaps some religious practices. The Mycenaeans had a writing system, Linear B, adapted from the Minoan Linear A. Unlike Linear A, Linear B has been deciphered. It was cracked in 1952 by Michael Ventris, who discovered that it was used to write an early form of Greek. The Linear B tablets are mostly administrative documents recording economic transactions, inventories, and personnel lists. They tell us about the organization of Mycenaean society, about the palace economy, and about the concerns of the rulers and administrators. From these tablets, we learn that Mycenaean society was highly organized and bureaucratic. The palace controlled large amounts of land, livestock, and people. There were officials with specific titles and responsibilities. There were craftsmen specializing in various trades, working under the direction of the palace. There were farmers, shepherds, and laborers, all part of a complex economic system. Religion was important to the Mycenaeans. The Linear B tablets mention various gods and goddesses, some of whom we recognize from later Greek religion. Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Hermes, Athena, Artemis, and Dionysus all appear in the tablets, showing that the major gods of classical Greece had roots in Mycenaean times. The Mycenaeans built shrines and conducted sacrifices, offering animals and valuable goods to the gods. Daily life for ordinary Mycenaeans was agricultural. Most people lived in small villages surrounding the palaces. They grew wheat, barley, olives, grapes, and figs. They raised sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle. They fished and hunted. Life was shaped by the seasons, by the rhythm of planting and harvest, by the demands of the palace for taxes and labour. The Mycenaean period was also the time of the Trojan War, or at least the time when the events that inspired the later stories of the Trojan War may have occurred. According to legend, a coalition of Greek kingdoms, led by Agamemnon of Mycenae, sailed across the Aegean to attack the city of Troy in Asia Minor. The war lasted 10 years and ended with the destruction of Troy. The Trojan War was immortalized in epic poetry, particularly Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, composed centuries later. These poems tell of heroes like Achilles, Hector, Odysseus, and Ajax, of divine intervention by the gods, and of the struggles and tragedies of war. For the ancient Greeks, the Trojan War was a foundational event, a time when their ancestors performed great deeds. Modern archaeology has shown that Troy was a real city and that it was indeed destroyed around 1200 BC at the end of the Mycenaean period. Whether the war happened as described in the poems is unknown. There may have been a historical conflict that inspired the legends, or the poems may be a mythologized memory of multiple conflicts and events. Regardless, the Trojan War became central to Greek identity and culture. Around 1200 BC, the Mycenaean world collapsed. Palaces were destroyed, many sites were abandoned, and the writing system fell out of use. This collapse was part of a broader crisis affecting the entire eastern Mediterranean. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia fell, cities in the Near East were destroyed, and Egypt was invaded by groups called the Sea Peoples. It was a time of widespread disruption and chaos. The causes of the collapse are debated. It may have been due to invasions, climate change, internal rebellions, economic collapse, or a combination of factors. The archaeological evidence shows destruction layers at many sites, suggesting violence, but also evidence of abandonment and decline. Whatever the causes, the result was clear. The Bronze Age civilization of the Mycenaeans came to an end. The Dark Age, a time of silence. After the collapse of Mycenaean civilization, Greece entered a period often called the Dark Age, lasting roughly from 1100 to 800 BC. It's called the Dark Age not because it was a terrible time to live, but because we know so little about it. Writing disappeared with the linear B system, and without written records, it's difficult to understand what was happening. We rely on archaeology, on the remains of settlements and burials, but these can only tell us so much. The Dark Age was a time of significant population decline. Many settlements were abandoned, and those that remained were much smaller than before. The great palaces were gone, and the complex administrative systems they supported vanished. Trade declined, and connections with the wider Mediterranean world weakened. People returned to a simpler way of life, more isolated and less interconnected. But this wasn't a time of complete stagnation. Life continued, communities adapted, and in some ways new foundations were being laid. Without the palace systems, communities became more local and independent. Leadership was probably based on kinship and personal relationships rather than on bureaucratic hierarchies. Big men, individuals who could gather followers through their wealth, skill, or charisma, may have been the leaders. People lived in small villages, supporting themselves through farming and herding. They grew the same crops as before: wheat, barley, olives, grapes. They kept the same animals. Technology continued, though it became simpler. Pottery from the early Dark Age is less elaborate than Mycenaean pottery, featuring geometric patterns rather than the natural and figurative designs of earlier periods. One significant development during the Dark Age was the adoption of iron. Iron ore is more common than the copper and tin needed to make bronze, and iron tools and weapons, once properly made, can be harder and keep an edge longer. The knowledge of iron working spread through the Mediterranean during this period, gradually replacing bronze. This democratized access to metal tools and weapons as iron was more readily available than bronze. Burial practices changed during the Dark Age. Cremation became more common, with the ashes of the dead placed in urns and buried. In some regions, people began to bury their dead in individual graves rather than communal tombs. These changes suggest shifts in beliefs about death and the afterlife, though exactly what people believed is unclear. Despite the lack of writing, oral tradition continued. Stories, songs, and poems were passed down from generation to generation. Bards and poets would recite tales of heroes and gods, keeping alive the memories, perhaps distorted and mythologized, of the Mycenaean past. These oral traditions would eventually be written down, becoming the epic poems we know, but during the Dark Age, they existed only in performance and memory. Toward the end of the Dark Age, things began to change. Population started to increase. Trade slowly resumed. Greeks began to have contact again with the wider world, particularly with the Phoenicians, a seafaring people from the eastern Mediterranean who traded throughout the region. From the Phoenicians, the Greeks adopted and adapted an alphabet, transforming it into the Greek alphabet still used today. This would have profound consequences, as it made literacy more accessible and would eventually enable the flourishing of Greek literature and philosophy. Around 800 BC, new patterns of settlement were emerging. People were coming together in larger communities, forming the Polis, the city-states that would define classical Greece. The Dark Age was ending, and a new era was beginning. The Archaic period, the birth of the Polis. The Archaic period, from around 800 to 480 BC, was a time of transformation. This was when the foundations of classical Greek civilization were laid, when the city-states emerged, when Greek culture began to take the form we recognize. It was a time of growth, innovation, conflict, and expansion. The defining feature of the Archaic period was the polis, the city-state. A polis was more than just a city. It was a community of citizens, a political entity, a religious center, and an economic unit. Each polis was independent, with its own government, laws, and customs. The loyalty of a Greek was to their polis. They were Athenians, Spartans, Corinthians, or Thebans before they were Greeks. A typical polis consisted of an urban center and the surrounding countryside. The urban center would have an agora, a central marketplace and gathering place where people would meet, trade, and discuss matters. It would have temples to the gods and goddesses the city honored. On a nearby hill, there might be an acropolis, a fortified high point that could serve as a refuge in times of danger and as a sacred space for important temples. Life in the polis was communal. Citizens, typically adult males who owned land, would participate in the political life of the city. They would gather in assemblies to make decisions, vote on laws, and choose leaders. They would serve in the military, defending the city against enemies. They would participate in religious festivals, honoring the gods and strengthening community bonds. But not everyone in a polis was a citizen. Women, foreigners, and slaves were excluded from political participation. Women's lives were largely confined to the household. They managed domestic affairs, raised children, and produced textiles. In some cities, like Athens, women were quite restricted in their movements and interactions. In others, like Sparta, they had more freedom and responsibility. Slavery was an accepted part of Greek society. Slaves might be prisoners of war, children of slaves, or people who had fallen into debt. They worked in households, on farms, in workshops, and in mines. Their treatment varied. Some were treated relatively well and might even earn their freedom. Others, particularly those working in the silver mines, endured brutal conditions. During the Archaic period, Greece experienced significant population growth. This led to land shortages and social tensions. One response was colonization. Greeks began to establish colonies throughout the Mediterranean and Black Sea regions. These colonies were independent cities not ruled by the mother city, though they maintained cultural and sometimes economic ties. Greek colonies were founded in southern Italy and Sicily, so many that the region became known as Magna Graecia, Great Greece. They established cities on the coasts of the Black Sea, in North Africa, in southern France, and in Spain. These colonies spread Greek culture and facilitated trade. They also relieved population pressure in Greece itself. The Archaic period saw the emergence of distinctive forms of Greek art. Pottery became more sophisticated with the development of the black figure technique, where figures were painted in black on the red clay background with details incised. Later came the red figure technique, where the background was painted black and the figures left in red, allowing for more detailed and realistic depictions. Sculpture also developed. Early archaic sculptures, called kouroi for males and korai for females, were somewhat stiff and stylized, but as the period progressed, sculptors became more skilled at depicting the human body realistically. They learned to show anatomy accurately, to suggest movement and emotion, to carve drapery that looked like real fabric. Architecture flourished. Greeks built temples in honor of their gods, using increasingly sophisticated designs. The Doric order, with its sturdy columns and simple capitals, was developed. The Ionic order, with its more slender columns and scroll-shaped capitals, emerged in eastern Greece. These temples were built of limestone or marble, with careful attention to proportion and harmony. One of the most important developments of the Archaic period was the creation of the Greek alphabet. By adapting the Phoenician alphabet and adding symbols for vowels, the Greeks created a writing system that was easier to learn and use than previous scripts. This spread literacy beyond a small scribal class and made possible a flourishing of literature. The Archaic period was when Greek literature truly began. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, epic poems that told of the Trojan War and its aftermath, were composed, or at least written down during this time. These poems, thousands of lines long, were written in a special poetic language and meter. They celebrated heroes, explored themes of honor, fate, and mortality, and shaped Greek values and ideals. Hesiod, another early poet, wrote the Theogony, which described the origins of the gods and works and days, a poem about farming and justice. Lyric poets emerged, writing shorter poems about personal feelings, love, politics, and everyday life. Sappho, from the island of Lesbos, wrote beautiful poems about love and desire. Archilochus wrote poems that were often cynical and realistic, very different from the heroic tone of epic. Religion was central to Greek life. The Greeks were polytheists, worshipping many gods and goddesses. The major gods lived on Mount Olympus, the highest mountain in Greece. Zeus was the king of the gods, wielder of the thunderbolt, god of the sky and justice. Hera was his wife, goddess of marriage. Poseidon was god of the sea, Athena goddess of wisdom and warfare, Apollo god of music and prophecy, Artemis goddess of the hunt, Aphrodite goddess of love, Hermes messenger of the gods, and so on. The gods were immortal and powerful, but they weren't all-knowing or perfectly good. They had human-like emotions and flaws. They could be jealous, angry, loving, or playful. They intervened in human affairs, sometimes helping people, sometimes harming them. The Greeks honoured the gods with sacrifices, festivals, and prayers, hoping to win their favour or at least avoid their anger. Oracles were places where people could seek advice from the gods. The most famous oracle was at Delphi, sacred to Apollo. People from all over Greece, and even beyond, would travel to Delphi to ask questions of the god. The priestess, called the Pythia, would enter a trance and deliver the god's response, which was often cryptic and required interpretation. Athletic competitions were also religious in nature. The Olympic Games, held every 4 years at Olympia in honor of Zeus, began in 776 BC, the traditional date marking the beginning of the Archaic period. Athletes from different cities would compete in running, wrestling, boxing, chariot racing, and other events. Winners received olive wreaths and great honour. The games were so important that warring cities would declare truces to allow athletes and spectators to travel safely. Politically, the Archaic period saw many experiments. Some cities were ruled by kings, though kingship was declining. Others were ruled by aristocracies, small groups of wealthy landowners. Many cities experienced periods of tyranny, where a single individual, often with popular support, would seize power. Despite the negative connotations of the word tyrant today, Greek tyrants weren't always cruel or oppressive. Some were effective rulers who brought stability and prosperity. Athens, which would become the most famous Greek city, began to develop its distinctive political system during the Archaic period. In 594 BC, a statesman named Solon was given emergency powers to solve Athens' social and economic problems. He instituted reforms that cancelled debts, freed Athenians who had been enslaved due to debt, and revised the laws. He created a council of 400 members and allowed all citizens, regardless of wealth, to participate in the assembly and law courts. These reforms didn't solve all problems, but they were steps toward democracy. Later, in 510 BC, another Athenian statesman, Cleisthenes, instituted further reforms that are considered the foundation of Athenian democracy. He reorganized the citizen body into new tribes based on geography rather than kinship, breaking the power of old aristocratic families. He created the Council of 500, whose members were chosen by lot. He may have instituted ostracism, a procedure where citizens could vote to exile a dangerous individual for 10 years. Sparta, Athens' great rival, developed in a very different direction. Sparta became a militaristic society focused entirely on military excellence. Spartan boys were taken from their families at age 7 and raised in military barracks, undergoing harsh training to make them into warriors. Spartan men lived communally, eating together in messes, and were expected to be ready for war at any time. Spartan society was rigidly hierarchical. At the top were the Spartiates, full Spartan citizens who were the warrior elite. Below them were the Perioikoi, free non-citizens who handled trade and crafts. At the bottom were the Helots, a subjugated population that worked the land. The Helots vastly outnumbered the Spartiates, and fear of Helot rebellion shaped Spartan society, contributing to its militarism. Spartan women had more freedom and responsibility than women in most other Greek cities. They could own property, were educated, and were expected to maintain physical fitness. This was partly because the men were often away at war or living in barracks, so women needed to manage estates and raise children with less male supervision. The Archaic period ended with the Persian Wars, a series of conflicts between Greek city-states and the Persian Empire, the largest empire in the world at that time. These wars would test the Greeks, forcing them to cooperate against a common enemy, and would set the stage for the glories of the classical period. The Persian Wars, Greeks united against empire. The Persian Empire, founded by Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BC, had expanded to control a vast territory stretching from Egypt to India. It was a sophisticated, well-organized empire with a professional army and immense resources. To the Persians, the small, quarrelsome Greek city-states on the western edge of their empire were of minor importance. The conflict began when Greek cities in Ionia, on the coast of Asia Minor, rebelled against Persian rule around 499 BC. Athens and Eretria sent help to the rebels. The rebellion was ultimately crushed, but the Persian king Darius I decided to punish the mainland Greeks who had interfered. In 490 BC, a Persian fleet crossed the Aegean and landed at Marathon, a plain northeast of Athens. The Athenians marched to meet them with a force of about 10,000 hoplites, heavily armed infantry soldiers. The Athenians were outnumbered, but they had advantages. They knew the terrain, they were defending their homeland, and they had developed effective tactics. The Greek hoplites fought in a phalanx, a dense formation of soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, their shields overlapping, their long spears projecting forward. The phalanx was incredibly strong from the front, but vulnerable on the flanks. The Athenians, led by the general Miltiades, charged the Persian forces, breaking through their centre and routing them. It was a stunning victory. The Persians retreated to their ships, having suffered heavy casualties. Legend says that a runner, Phidippides, ran from Marathon to Athens, about 26 miles, to announce the victory, then collapsed and died. This story inspired the modern marathon race, though historians debate whether it really happened. The victory at Marathon was a great source of pride for Athens. It showed that Greek hoplites could defeat the supposedly invincible Persian army, but it wasn't the end of the conflict. Darius planned another invasion, but he died before he could launch it. His son, Xerxes, took up the task. Xerxes' invasion in 480 BC was on a massive scale. Ancient sources, which tend to exaggerate, claim he had millions of soldiers, though modern estimates suggest hundreds of thousands. The Persian army marched through Thrace and into northern Greece. The Persian navy sailed along the coast, providing support. The Greeks initially couldn't agree on how to respond. Many northern cities submitted to the Persians without fighting, but a coalition of cities, led by Sparta and Athens, decided to resist. They chose to make a stand at Thermopylae, a narrow pass between the mountains and the sea, where the Persian numbers would count for less. King Leonidas of Sparta led a force of about 7,000 Greeks to Thermopylae. For 2 days, they held the pass against repeated Persian assaults. The narrow terrain prevented the Persians from using their numerical advantage, and the Greek hoplites were more heavily armed and armoured than the Persian infantry. But a local resident showed the Persians a mountain path that led around the pass. When Leonidas learned that the Persians were outflanking him, he dismissed most of his forces. He and 300 Spartans, along with some Thespians and Thebans, remained to fight a delaying action. They fought to the last man, buying time for the rest of the Greek forces to retreat and prepare defences further south. The Persians marched into central Greece and captured Athens. The city had been evacuated, the Athenians had fled to the island of Salamis and other places. The Persians burned the Acropolis and destroyed the city. It must have been devastating for the Athenians to see their city in flames. But Athens still had its navy. the Athenian statesman Themistocles had convinced the Athenians to invest in building a large fleet of warships called triremes. Now, that fleet was the Greeks' best hope. Themistocles urged the Greek forces to fight a naval battle in the narrow straits between Salamis and the mainland, where the Persian fleet's size would be a disadvantage. The Battle of Salamis, fought in September of 480 BC, was a decisive Greek victory. The Persian ships crowded into the narrow waters and became disorganized. The Greek triremes, more maneuverable in the confined space, rammed and sank many Persian vessels. Xerxes, watching from a throne on shore, saw his fleet destroyed. He returned to Persia, leaving his general Mardonius with an army to continue the campaign. The following year, 479 BC, the Greeks defeated the Persian army at the Battle of Plataea in central Greece. The combined Greek forces, with Spartans forming the core of the army, decisively defeated Mardonius, who was killed in the battle. On the same day, according to tradition, the Greek fleet defeated the remaining Persian forces at Mycale on the coast of Asia Minor. The Persian wars were over. Greece had survived. The victory had profound effects. It created a sense of Greek identity and unity, however temporary. It demonstrated the effectiveness of Greek military organization and tactics. It boosted the confidence of the Greek cities, particularly Athens. And it set the stage for the golden age of Greek culture that would follow. The golden age of Athens: democracy, drama, and philosophy. The decades after the Persian Wars were a time of extraordinary achievement for Athens, often called the Golden Age. This was when Athenian democracy reached its fullest expression, when philosophy and drama flourished, when the Parthenon was built, when Athens became the cultural centre of the Greek world. After the Persian Wars, Athens led the formation of the Delian League, an alliance of Greek cities ostensibly created to defend against future Persian aggression. Cities contributed ships or money, and Athens, with the largest navy, naturally became the leader. But over time, the League transformed into an Athenian empire. Athens demanded tribute from member cities and enforced its will with its powerful navy. Cities that tried to leave the League were forcibly kept in. The tribute from the Delian League made Athens wealthy. This wealth funded an ambitious building program. Pericles, the leading Athenian statesman from 461 to 429 BC, oversaw the reconstruction of the Acropolis, which the Persians had destroyed. The centerpiece was the Parthenon, a temple to Athena, the city's patron goddess. The Parthenon, completed in 432 BC, was a masterpiece of architecture and sculpture. Built of white marble, it had 46 columns surrounding a central chamber that housed a massive statue of Athena covered in gold and ivory. The temple was decorated with elaborate sculptures showing scenes from mythology. Every line, every proportion was carefully calculated to create a sense of harmony and beauty. Even today, in ruins, the Parthenon is one of the most recognizable buildings in the world. Athenian democracy during this period was direct, rather than representative. All male citizens could participate in the assembly, which met regularly on a hill called the Pnyx. They would debate and vote on laws, policies, and decisions. Important matters might be decided by majority vote of the thousands of citizens present. Day-to-day administration was handled by the Council of 500, whose members were chosen by lot for one-year terms. Courts were staffed by large juries, also chosen by lot. Most officials were chosen by lot rather than election, based on the democratic principle that any citizen was capable of serving. This system had its limitations. It excluded women, foreigners, and slaves, who together made up the majority of Athens' population. It could be swayed by persuasive speakers, leading to poor decisions. But it was a radical experiment in giving ordinary people a direct say in governing themselves. The Golden Age was also when Greek drama reached its peak. Tragedy and comedy were performed at festivals in honor of Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy. The tragedies explored deep themes of fate, justice, family, and the relationship between humans and gods. They took stories from mythology and asked hard questions about moral responsibility and human suffering. Aeschylus, the earliest of the great tragedians, wrote powerful plays about justice and the will of the gods. His Orestia trilogy told of murder, revenge, and the establishment of law courts to replace blood feuds. Sophocles wrote about individuals struggling against fate and their own flaws. His Oedipus Rex explored a man's futile attempt to escape a prophecy that he would kill his father and marry his mother. Euripides, the youngest of the three, wrote plays that were more psychological and questioning, often challenging traditional values and showing the suffering of women and the marginalized. Comedies, particularly those by Aristophanes, were biting satires of contemporary Athenian life. They mocked politicians, intellectuals, social trends, and even the gods. Aristophanes' plays are full of crude humour, fantastic plots, and sharp political commentary. They give us insights into what Athenians found funny, what they worried about, and how they saw themselves. Philosophy flourished in Athens during this period. The sophists, travelling teachers, taught rhetoric and argumentation, sometimes for large fees. They questioned traditional values and beliefs, asking what justice really was, whether morality was natural or conventional, and how one could know anything for certain. Socrates, the most famous Athenian philosopher, spent his days in the Agora engaging people in conversation. He would ask questions, probing their beliefs and assumptions, showing that they didn't really understand the things they claimed to know. Socrates wrote nothing himself, but his student Plato recorded his ideas in dialogues, philosophical conversations that explored questions of knowledge, virtue, justice, and the good life. Socrates believed that the unexamined life was not worth living. He thought that virtue was knowledge, that no one willingly did wrong, and that the most important thing was to care for one's soul. His questioning made him enemies among powerful Athenians. In 399 BC, he was put on trial for corrupting the youth and impiety. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. He could have proposed exile instead, but he chose to drink poison hemlock, dying surrounded by his friends and students. Plato, devastated by his teacher's death, went on to found the Academy, a school where philosophy and mathematics were studied. Plato developed a complex philosophy, believing that the physical world was just a shadow of a higher realm of perfect, eternal forms. He wrote extensively on politics, believing that the ideal state would be ruled by philosopher kings who understood the forms and could govern justly. Plato's student Aristotle would go on to found his own school, the Lyceum, and develop a philosophy that was more empirical and systematic. But that was later, after the Golden Age had ended. History was invented, or at least developed into a systematic discipline during this period. Herodotus, called the father of history, wrote an account of the Persian Wars. He travelled widely, collecting stories and information, trying to understand why the wars happened and what they meant. His work is full of fascinating digressions about different peoples and customs. Thucydides, an Athenian general, wrote a history of the Peloponnesian War, the long conflict between Athens and Sparta. His history is more analytical and critical than Herodotus's. He focused on political and military events, trying to explain causes and consequences. He believed that by understanding the past, people might better understand the present and future, that human nature was constant, and that similar situations would lead to similar outcomes. Medicine was becoming more systematic. Hippocrates, from the island of Kos, established medicine as a profession and developed the idea that diseases had natural causes rather than being punishments from the gods. The Hippocratic Corpus, a collection of medical texts, includes careful observations of symptoms and treatments. The Hippocratic Oath, traditionally attributed to Hippocrates, set ethical standards for physicians. Science and mathematics were also developing. Pythagoras, though he lived earlier, in the 6th century BC, had founded a philosophical and religious movement that emphasized mathematics. The Pythagoreans discovered mathematical relationships in music and geometry, and Pythagoras is credited with the famous theorem about right triangles, though it's unclear if he actually proved it. Daily life in Golden Age Athens was a mixture of public and private activities. Men would wake early, perhaps exercise at a gymnasium, then spend time in the Agora conducting business, discussing politics, or simply socializing. They might attend the assembly if it was meeting, or go to the law courts. In the evening, they might attend a symposium, a drinking party, where men would recline on couches, drink wine, discuss philosophy or poetry, and be entertained by musicians and dancers. Women's lives were more restricted. Respectable women spent most of their time in the women's quarters of the house. They managed household slaves, spun and wove cloth, and raised children. They couldn't own property or make legal contracts. Their opportunities for education and public life were limited. When they went out, they were usually veiled and accompanied. However, there were exceptions. Priestesses held important religious roles. Aspasia, the companion of Pericles, was famous for her intelligence and influence, though she was also the subject of gossip and criticism. Heterae, educated courtesans, could attend symposia and have relationships with influential men. Slavery was integral to the Athenian economy. Slaves worked in homes, on farms, in workshops, and in the silver mines. Some slaves were skilled craftsmen or educators. The relationship between master and slave could vary from brutal to relatively benign, but slaves had no legal rights and could be bought, sold, or punished at their owner's discretion. Food in Athens was simple for most people. Bread or porridge made from barley or wheat was the staple. People ate olives, cheese, onions, garlic, and whatever vegetables were available. Fish was common for those living near the sea. Meat was eaten less frequently, usually at festivals or sacrifices. Wine, mixed with water, was the standard drink. Meals were often social occasions, a time for families or friends to gather. The Golden Age of Athens was a remarkable period, but it was built on inequalities and would not last. The tensions between Athens and Sparta, between the democratic and oligarchic visions of how Greek cities should be organized, were growing. War was coming. The Peloponnesian War, Greeks against Greeks. The Peloponnesian War, lasting from 431 to 404 BC, was a devastating conflict between Athens and its empire and a coalition led by Sparta. It's called the Peloponnesian War because Sparta and many of its allies were from the Peloponnese, the southern peninsula of Greece. The war had deep causes. Athens' growing power and ambition threatened other Greek cities. The transformation of the Delian League into an Athenian empire created resentment. Sparta feared Athenian expansion and the spread of democratic ideas. Specific disputes over allies and colonies brought tensions to a breaking point. The war can be divided into several phases. The first phase, the Archidamian War, lasted from 431 to 421 BC. Sparta and its allies would invade Attica, the territory around Athens, each year, ravaging the countryside. Athens, protected by its walls and supplied by sea, would endure. The Athenians would use their navy to raid the Peloponnese and support rebellions against Sparta. Pericles' strategy was to avoid land battles, where Sparta was superior, and rely on Athens' naval strength and financial reserves to outlast the enemy. It was a strategy of endurance, not glory. Many Athenians found it frustrating. Then disaster struck. In 430 BC, a plague broke out in Athens. The city was crowded with refugees from the countryside, creating perfect conditions for disease to spread. The plague killed thousands, perhaps a quarter of the population. Even Pericles died of it in 429 BC. The exact nature of the disease is unknown. It might have been typhus, smallpox, measles, or something else. Thucydides described the plague in harrowing detail. He himself caught it, but survived. He wrote of bodies piled in the streets, of people abandoning the sick and dying, of the breakdown of social norms as people despaired. The plague weakened Athens materially and psychologically. The war continued with mixed results for both sides. There were battles, sieges, raids, and atrocities. Neither side could gain a decisive advantage. In 421 BC, they agreed to the Peace of Nicias, named after the Athenian general who negotiated it. The peace was supposed to last 50 years. It lasted only 6. The truce was unstable, with both sides manoeuvring and supporting their allies in conflicts. In 415 BC, Athens launched an expedition to Sicily, ostensibly to help allies, but really to conquer the rich city of Syracuse. It was an ambitious, perhaps overly ambitious, plan. The Sicilian expedition was a disaster. The Athenian force was large, but it faced determined resistance. The siege of Syracuse dragged on. Sparta sent help to Syracuse. Athenian reinforcements arrived, but couldn't turn the tide. In 413 BC, the Athenians tried to retreat, but were caught and destroyed. Thousands of Athenian soldiers were killed or captured. Those captured were imprisoned in stone quarries under horrible conditions, and many died. The defeat in Sicily was catastrophic for Athens. It lost a huge portion of its military forces and its financial reserves. Morale plummeted. Some allies saw weakness and rebelled. Sparta, encouraged by the Athenian disaster and supported by Persian gold, pressed its advantage. The final phase of the war, the Ionian or Decelean War, saw Athens fighting desperately for survival. Sparta established a permanent garrison at Decelia, just north of Athens, disrupting Athenian agriculture and allowing slaves to escape. Athens was under constant pressure, yet Athens fought on with remarkable resilience. The Athenians rebuilt their fleet and won several naval victories. There were moments when it seemed Athens might survive, but Sparta allied with Persia, which provided money to build ships. This shifted the balance. In 405 BC, the Spartans, led by the general Lysander, destroyed the Athenian fleet at Aegospotami on the Hellespont. Athens was now cut off from its grain supply from the Black Sea. Starvation loomed. Athens was besieged. In 404 BC, the Athenians surrendered. The terms were harsh, but not as harsh as they might have been. Athens' walls were torn down. Its fleet was reduced to a handful of ships. It lost its empire and had to become an ally of Sparta. Democracy was overthrown, and a pro-Spartan oligarchy, the 30 Tyrants, was installed. But Athens itself was not destroyed, its people not enslaved, thanks in part to Sparta's allies who remembered Athens' role in the Persian Wars. The Peloponnesian War was a tragedy. It weakened all the Greek cities. Thousands died, cities were destroyed, the social fabric was torn. Trust and cooperation, never easy among the competitive Greeks, became even harder, and the great age of Athenian democracy and culture was over, at least for a time. The 4th century, turmoil and transition. The 4th century BC was a time of political instability, social change, and shifting power dynamics. The Peloponnesian War had exhausted the Greek cities, but they quickly returned to their old patterns of rivalry and conflict. In Athens, the 30 tyrants ruled harshly, executing opponents and confiscating property, but their rule lasted less than a year. In 403 BC, Democrats, led by Thrasybulus, overthrew the oligarchy and restored democracy. The Athenians proclaimed an amnesty, trying to heal the wounds of civil conflict. Athens slowly recovered. It rebuilt its walls, despite Spartan objections. It regained some of its prosperity and cultural vitality, but it would never regain its empire or its dominant position in Greece. Other powers were rising. Sparta, the victor of the Peloponnesian War, found that victory brought problems. It now had to manage the affairs of many cities, a role for which its rigid military society was not well suited. Sparta installed oligarchic governments in cities it controlled, often backed by Spartan garrisons. This created resentment. Sparta also faced problems at home. The number of full Spartan citizens was declining. Warfare, earthquakes, and social factors reduced the Spartiate population. With fewer citizens, Sparta had fewer soldiers for its phalanx, and it had to rely more on allies and perioikoi. Thebes, a city in central Greece, emerged as a major power. Thebes had fought on the Persian side during the Persian Wars and had been alternately allied with and against Sparta during the Peloponnesian War. In 371 BC, Thebes defeated Sparta at the Battle of Leuctra, shocking the Greek world. The Theban general Epaminondas had innovated tactics, strengthening one wing of his phalanx to 50 men deep and using it to crush the Spartan right. Thebes followed up by invading the Peloponnese, liberating the Helots of Messenia, who had been enslaved by Sparta for centuries. Without the labour of the Helots, Sparta's economy and society were crippled. Sparta remained significant, but its days of hegemony were over. Theban dominance didn't last long either. After Epaminondas was killed in battle in 362 BC, Thebes lacked effective leadership. The Greek cities remained locked in cycles of conflict, unable to unite, unwilling to accept any city's dominance. Philosophy continued to flourish despite the political turmoil. Plato's academy was a centre of learning. Plato wrote dialogues exploring questions of justice, knowledge, love, and the nature of reality. His Republic described an ideal city-state ruled by philosopher kings, where each person fulfilled their proper role and justice prevailed. Aristotle, Plato's student, eventually left Athens and became the tutor of a young Macedonian prince named Alexander. Later, Aristotle returned to Athens and founded the Lyceum. Aristotle's philosophy was broad and systematic. He wrote on logic, metaphysics, ethics, politics, biology, physics, poetry, and rhetoric. He emphasized observation and categorization, studying the natural world systematically. Aristotle believed in the golden mean, that virtue lay in moderation between extremes. He thought that humans were political animals, naturally living in communities. He studied different forms of government, analyzing their strengths and weaknesses. His work would influence Western thought for centuries. Other philosophical schools emerged. The Cynics, following Diogenes of Sinope, rejected conventional values and material possessions, living simply and advocating a return to nature. Diogenes famously lived in a barrel and owned almost nothing. He mocked the powerful and flouted social norms. Orators became prominent in Athens. Demosthenes was the most famous. He delivered powerful speeches warning Athenians about the growing threat of Macedonia. His Philippics attacked Philip II of Macedon, arguing that Philip's ambitions threatened Greek freedom. Demosthenes' speeches are masterpieces of rhetoric, full of emotion and argument. But Demosthenes' warnings went largely unheeded. Macedonia, a kingdom to the north of Greece, was growing in power. The Macedonians were Greek-speaking, but were considered semi-barbarous by the Greeks of the city-states. They had a monarchy, not the republican governments of the Polis. Philip II became king of Macedonia in 359 BC. He was intelligent, ambitious, and ruthless. He reformed the Macedonian army, creating the phalanx of pikemen, soldiers armed with long spears called sarissas. The Macedonian phalanx was even more formidable than the traditional Greek hoplite phalanx. Philip expanded Macedonian territory, conquering neighbouring regions and gaining control of gold mines that financed his ambitions. He intervened in Greek affairs, sometimes as a mediator, sometimes as a conqueror. He played cities against each other, exploiting their rivalries. Athens and Thebes finally united against Philip. In 338 BC, they met his army at Cheronea in central Greece. Philip commanded the Macedonians, with his 18-year-old son Alexander leading the cavalry. The Greeks fought bravely, but the Macedonians won decisively. After Cheronea, Philip established the League of Corinth, which included all Greek cities except Sparta. The League ostensibly maintained the autonomy of member cities, but was really a tool of Macedonian control. Philip was elected as the League's leader and proposed a campaign against Persia, framing it as revenge for the Persian Wars. But Philip was assassinated in 336 BC at his daughter's wedding by one of his bodyguards. The motives remain unclear, possibly personal, possibly political. His son Alexander inherited the throne. Alexander the Great, Conquest and Legacy. Alexander III of Macedon, known to history as Alexander the Great, was 20 years old when he became king. He was intelligent, educated, charismatic, and ruthlessly ambitious. He had been tutored by Aristotle, who instilled in him a love of Homer and Greek culture. From his father, he learned warfare and leadership. Some Greek cities saw Philip's death as an opportunity to rebel. Thebes revolted. Alexander marched south with his army and destroyed Thebes, selling the survivors into slavery. It was a brutal warning. The other Greek cities submitted. In 334 BC, Alexander crossed into Asia with an army of about 40,000 men, including Macedonians, Greeks, and allies. His stated goal was to conquer Persia, to avenge the Persian invasions of Greece, but Alexander's ambitions would take him far beyond that. At the Granicus River, Alexander won his first major victory against Persian forces. At Issus, in 333 BC, he defeated a large Persian army led by King Darius III. Darius fled, leaving behind his family who were captured. Alexander treated them with respect, showing the magnanimity that would characterize some of his actions. Alexander marched down the coast of the eastern Mediterranean, capturing cities. The city of Tyre, on an island off the coast of modern-day Lebanon, resisted. Alexander besieged it for 7 months, eventually building a causeway from the mainland to the island and breaching the walls. The fall of Tyre showed Alexander's determination and engineering skill. Egypt welcomed Alexander as a liberator from Persian rule. He was crowned pharaoh and founded the city of Alexandria, which would become one of the great cities of the ancient world. While in Egypt, Alexander visited the oracle of Ammon at the Siwa oasis, where he was reportedly told that he was the son of Zeus Ammon, a divine origin that he may have come to believe. In 331 BC, Alexander faced Darius again at Gaugamela in Mesopotamia. The Persian army was enormous, including cavalry, chariots, and war elephants. Alexander's army was much smaller, but it was better trained and better led. Alexander personally led a cavalry charge that broke through the Persian lines, and Darius fled again. Persia's major cities fell to Alexander: Babylon, Susa, Persepolis, Ecbatana. At Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, Alexander's troops plundered the city and burned the great palace. Whether this was revenge for the Persian burning of Athens, or a drunken accident, or a calculated political act, is debated. Darius was eventually killed by his own subordinates as he fled eastward. Alexander pursued his killers into Central Asia, into regions that are now Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. The campaign was difficult. The terrain was harsh, the local tribes fierce. Alexander founded cities, garrisoned them with veterans, and continued east. Alexander's army began to grumble. They had been campaigning for years, far from home in strange lands. They were tired and wanted to return. But Alexander pushed on, crossing the Hindu Kush mountains into India in 326 BC. In India, Alexander faced King Porus at the Battle of the Hydaspes. Porus had a large army including war elephants, which the Macedonians had never fought in such numbers. The battle was hard fought, but Alexander won. Impressed by Porus's bravery, Alexander allowed him to remain as a vassal king. But Alexander's army had had enough. At the Hyphasis River, in modern-day Pakistan, they refused to go further. Alexander raged, but eventually he relented. The army turned back, marching through the Gedrosian desert, a harrowing journey where many died of thirst and heat. Alexander returned to Babylon in 323 BC. He was planning new campaigns, perhaps to Arabia, but he fell ill. The exact cause of his illness is unknown, possibly malaria, typhoid, poisoning, or something else. On June 10th or 11th, 323 BC, Alexander died. He was 32 years old. Alexander's conquests changed the world. He had created an empire stretching from Greece to India. He had spread Greek culture across this vast area, beginning a period called the Hellenistic Age, when Greek ideas, language, and culture blended with those of the conquered peoples. Alexander founded many cities, often named Alexandria. These cities became centers of Greek culture and learning. He encouraged intermarriage between Greeks and Persians. He adopted some Persian customs, wearing Persian dress and incorporating Persian nobles into his administration, though this angered some of his Macedonian followers. Alexander was complex and contradictory. He could be generous and magnanimous, showing mercy to defeated enemies, respecting local customs and religions. He could also be ruthless, destroying cities and massacring populations. He killed his own friend Clytus in a drunken rage. He forced his men to marry Persian women. He demanded to be worshipped as a god. His early death left a vacuum. He had no clear successor. When asked on his deathbed to whom he left his empire, he reportedly said, "To the strongest." His generals, known as the Diadochi, fought among themselves for control. These wars of the Diadochi lasted for decades. Eventually, the empire was divided into several kingdoms. Ptolemy took Egypt, founding a dynasty that would last until the Roman conquest. Seleucus took most of the Asian territories, establishing the Seleucid Empire. Antigonus and his descendants controlled parts of Greece and Asia Minor. Macedonia remained a separate kingdom. The Hellenistic Age, a Greek world. The Hellenistic Age, from Alexander's death in 323 BC to the Roman conquest of the last Hellenistic kingdom in 30 BC, was a time when Greek culture spread across a vast area. It was a cosmopolitan age, with Greeks living in cities from the Mediterranean to Central Asia, mixing with local populations, creating a hybrid culture. The Hellenistic kingdoms were monarchies, ruled by kings who were often military leaders. They controlled large territories with diverse populations. They employed bureaucracies to administer their realms, collect taxes, and maintain order. Power was more centralized than in the classical city-states. Alexandria in Egypt became the greatest city of the Hellenistic world. It had a magnificent harbour, wide streets, beautiful buildings, and a diverse population of Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, and others. The Ptolemies made it their capital and a centre of learning. The Library of Alexandria, founded in the 3rd century BC, was the most famous library of the ancient world. It aimed to collect all the world's knowledge. Scholars from across the Mediterranean came to Alexandria to study. The library may have contained hundreds of thousands of scrolls. It was a place of research, translation, and copying. Scholars at Alexandria made significant advances. Euclid wrote his Elements, a systematic treatment of geometry that would be used for over 2,000 years. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth with remarkable accuracy by comparing the angles of shadows in different cities. Aristarchus proposed that the earth revolved around the sun, an idea that wouldn't be widely accepted until the Renaissance. In medicine, Herophilus and Erasistratus conducted dissections of human bodies, advancing knowledge of anatomy. They studied the brain, the heart, the circulatory system, and the nervous system. Their work would influence medical understanding for centuries. The Hellenistic period saw the development of new philosophical schools. Epicurus founded a school in Athens, teaching that the goal of life was pleasure, defined as the absence of pain and fear. Epicureans believed that the gods didn't intervene in human affairs, and that death was the end. They advocated friendship, simple living, and the study of philosophy to overcome fear. The Stoics, founded by Zeno of Citium, taught that virtue was the only good, and that one should live in accordance with nature and reason. They believed that people should accept what they couldn't control and focus on what they could, their own thoughts and actions. Stoicism emphasized duty, self-discipline, and inner tranquility. Art in the Hellenistic period became more dramatic and emotional. Sculptors depicted a wider range of subjects and emotions. The Venus de Milo, the Winged Victory of Samothrace, and the Laocoön group are famous Hellenistic sculptures showing movement, emotion, and technical mastery. Architecture became grander. Cities were planned with grid layouts. There were theatres, gymnasiums, temples, and public buildings. The Colossus of Rhodes, a giant bronze statue of the sun god Helios, was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, though it stood for only 56 years before being toppled by an earthquake. Science and technology advanced. Archimedes, from Syracuse in Sicily, made discoveries in mathematics, physics, and engineering. He calculated pi, developed methods for finding areas and volumes, and invented war machines to defend his city against the Romans. His famous principle of buoyancy, discovered in a bathtub, led him to run through the streets shouting "Eureka!" meaning "I have found it." Trade flourished in the Hellenistic world. Goods moved across long distances. Silk from China, spices from India, ivory from Africa, and wine from Greece could all be found in the markets of Alexandria or Antioch. Cities grew wealthy from trade, and a merchant class emerged. But the Hellenistic world was also marked by conflict. The successor kingdoms fought each other, and there were internal rebellions and power struggles. Mercenary soldiers, rather than citizen armies, fought many wars. This was a period of professional soldiers and large, expensive armies. The relationship between Greeks and non-Greeks in the Hellenistic kingdoms was complex. Greeks often held privileged positions, serving as administrators, soldiers, and landowners. They maintained Greek institutions, language, and culture in their cities, but they also interacted with and were influenced by local cultures. In Egypt, the Ptolemies adopted the role of pharaohs, building temples in Egyptian style and supporting Egyptian religion, even as they promoted Greek culture. In the Seleucid Empire, Hellenization varied. Some regions adopted Greek culture extensively, while others maintained their own traditions. Judaism was significantly affected by Hellenism. Many Jews lived in the Hellenistic kingdoms, particularly in Alexandria. The Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek, the Septuagint, making Jewish scriptures accessible to Greek speakers. Some Jews adopted Greek customs and philosophy, while others resisted, leading to tensions. The status of women in the Hellenistic period varied. Royal women could wield significant power. Cleopatra VII, the last Ptolemaic ruler of Egypt, was a skilled politician and diplomat who played a major role in Roman politics. But for ordinary women, life was still constrained by patriarchal norms. Slavery continued to be widespread. Prisoners of war, children of slaves, and people captured by pirates could all end up enslaved. Slaves worked in households, on farms, in mines, and in workshops. Their experiences varied greatly depending on their owners and their roles. The Hellenistic age was a time of great achievement and complexity. It spread Greek culture far beyond Greece itself, creating a cosmopolitan world that influenced the regions it touched. But it was also a world of monarchies, professional armies, and social hierarchies, different in important ways from the classical Polis. Rome's arrival, the end of Greek independence. While the Hellenistic kingdoms rose and fell in the east, a new power was growing in the west, Rome. Rome began as a small city-state in Italy, but gradually conquered the Italian peninsula. It then expanded into the western Mediterranean, defeating Carthage in a series of wars. Rome's involvement in Greek affairs began in the 3rd century BC, when Greek cities in southern Italy asked for Roman help against various threats. But Rome's major intervention came in the 2nd century BC. In 197 BC, Rome declared war on Philip V of Macedon, partly to check Macedonian power and partly to support Greek allies. Roman legions, supported by Greek allies, defeated the Macedonians at Cynocephalae in 197 BC. Rome declared the Greeks free, a proclamation met with jubilation, though Roman freedom would come with strings attached. The Seleucid king Antiochus III, seeing an opportunity, invaded Greece. Rome responded, defeating him at Thermopylae in 191 BC, and again at Magnesia in 190 BC. The Seleucid Empire was forced to give up its territories in Asia Minor and pay a huge indemnity. Rome increasingly intervened in Greek affairs, playing the role of mediator and enforcer. Greek cities and kingdoms sought Roman support in their disputes, drawing Rome deeper into Eastern politics. Rome's power was immense, and few could resist its will. In 171 BC, Perseus of Macedon attempted to assert Macedonian independence. Rome declared war. At the Battle of Pydna in 168 BC, the Roman legions decisively defeated the Macedonian phalanx. Perseus was captured and brought to Rome. Macedonia was divided into 4 republics, nominally independent but under Roman supervision. In 146 BC, after a rebellion, Macedonia was made a Roman province. In the same year, the Romans destroyed the city of Corinth as punishment for resisting Roman authority. Greece, for the most part, fell under Roman control, though it retained some autonomy. The last great Hellenistic kingdom, Ptolemaic Egypt, managed to survive longer due to its wealth and the skill of its rulers. Cleopatra VII, the last Ptolemaic ruler, allied herself with Julius Caesar and later with Mark Antony, trying to use Rome's internal conflicts to preserve her kingdom. But after the naval Battle of Actium in 31 BC, where Octavian's forces defeated those of Antony and Cleopatra, Egypt's days were numbered. Antony and Cleopatra committed suicide in 30 BC, and Egypt became a Roman province. The Hellenistic age was over. Greek independence had ended, but Greek culture survived and even flourished under Roman rule. The Romans admired Greek culture, adopting Greek art, literature, philosophy, and religion. Educated Romans learned Greek, read Greek authors, and employed Greek tutors. As the Roman poet Horace wrote, "Captive Greece took captive her savage conqueror." Greek religion, gods, rituals, and beliefs. Throughout all these political changes, from the Dark Ages through the classical and Hellenistic periods, Greek religion remained a central part of life. The Greeks were polytheists, believing in many gods and goddesses who controlled different aspects of the world and human experience. The major gods lived on Mount Olympus according to mythology. Zeus was the king, ruler of the sky, wielder of thunderbolts, and enforcer of oaths and hospitality. His wife Hera was goddess of marriage and family, often portrayed as jealous of Zeus's many affairs. Poseidon ruled the seas and earthquakes, carrying a trident. Demeter was goddess of agriculture and the harvest, crucial in an agricultural society. Athena, goddess of wisdom, crafts, and warfare, was born fully grown from Zeus's head. She was the patron of Athens and many other cities. Apollo was god of music, poetry, prophecy, and the sun. He had an oracle at Delphi where people sought his advice. Artemis, Apollo's twin sister, was goddess of the hunt and wild places. She was also associated with childbirth. Aphrodite was goddess of love and beauty, born from the sea foam. Her son, Eros, often depicted as a young boy with a bow, caused people to fall in love. Ares was the god of war, violent and unpredictable. Hephaestus was the smith god, lame but skilled, who made weapons and armor for the gods. Hermes was the messenger god, god of travelers, merchants and thieves, quick and clever. Dionysus was god of wine, ecstasy, and theatre. His worship involved festivals where normal social rules were suspended, where people drank, danced, and lost themselves in divine madness. Dionysian festivals included dramatic performances, which evolved into Greek tragedy and comedy. Hades ruled the underworld, the realm of the dead. He was not evil, but stern and implacable. The underworld was a dim, shadowy place where the shades of the dead existed without joy or sorrow. Most Greeks didn't believe in a moral afterlife with rewards and punishments, though mystery religions promised better fates for initiates. Besides the Olympian gods, there were countless other deities, nymphs of rivers, trees, and mountains, the fates who determined each person's destiny, the Furies who punished oath-breakers and murderers. There were heroes, mortals, who had performed great deeds and were honoured after death, like Heracles, Theseus, and Achilles. Greek religion was very different from modern monotheistic religions. There was no sacred text, no organised church, no professional priesthood in the way we think of it. Religion was embedded in civic and family life. priests and priestesses were often citizens who held their positions for limited terms or for life, but who weren't a separate caste. Worship involved sacrifices, prayers, and festivals. Animal sacrifice was the central ritual. A valuable animal, usually a sheep, goat, pig, or cow, would be led to an altar, often accompanied by a procession. After prayers, the animal would be killed, its blood poured on the altar as an offering to the gods. The meat would be cooked and shared in a communal meal, with choice portions burned for the gods. Temples were not like churches or synagogues. They weren't places where congregations gathered for services, they were houses for the gods, containing cult statues. Worship occurred outside, at altars in front of the temple. Important civic ceremonies involved processions to temples, sacrifices, and sometimes banquets. Festivals were numerous and important. Nearly every city had its own calendar of festivals honouring various gods. The Panathenea in Athens honoured Athena with processions, sacrifices, athletic competitions, and performances. The city Dionysia featured dramatic competitions. The Eleusinian Mysteries, secret rites associated with Demeter and Persephone, promised initiates a better afterlife. The Olympic Games, held every 4 years at Olympia, were a religious festival honouring Zeus. Athletes from all over the Greek world competed. There were running races, wrestling, boxing, pancration, a brutal combination of wrestling and boxing, chariot racing, and the pentathlon. Victors received olive wreaths and great honour in their home cities. Oracles were places where gods answered questions. The most famous was the Oracle of Apollo at Delphi. Visitors would present questions, and the Pythia, Apollo's priestess, would enter a trance and deliver the god's response, often cryptic and ambiguous. Delphi wielded great influence. Cities consulted it before major decisions. Greek religion didn't have a strong concept of sin or orthodoxy. What mattered was performing the proper rituals, showing respect to the gods, and maintaining order. Impiety, neglecting the gods or showing them disrespect, was a serious offence. Socrates was accused of impiety, one of the charges that led to his execution. There was room for skepticism and debate. Some philosophers, like Xenophanes, criticized traditional beliefs about the gods. The sophists questioned whether gods existed, but for most Greeks, the gods were real and powerful, deserving respect and fear. Magic and superstition coexisted with official religion. People used curse tablets, small lead sheets inscribed with curses, asking gods or demons to harm enemies. They wore amulets for protection. They consulted seers and diviners to interpret omens. They believed in ghosts, monsters, and supernatural forces. Mystery religions, which required initiation and promised secret knowledge and a better afterlife, became popular, especially in the Hellenistic period. The Eleusinian Mysteries, the Orphic Mysteries, and later the cult of Isis from Egypt attracted many followers seeking more personal religious experiences. Greek religion evolved over time, influenced by contact with other cultures. In the Hellenistic period, Greek and Eastern religions blended. Gods were identified with each other, Zeus with the Egyptian Amun, Aphrodite with the Phoenician Astarte. New cults emerged, and old ones were reinterpreted. Greek art and architecture. Beauty in stone. Greek art is one of the civilization's most enduring legacies. From pottery to sculpture to architecture, Greek artists created works that have inspired people for millennia. Pottery was both utilitarian and artistic. Greeks made vessels for storing and transporting oil, wine, and grain, for mixing and drinking wine, for household use. But they decorated these vessels with intricate designs and scenes. In the geometric period, around 900 to 700 BC, pottery featured abstract patterns, zigzags, meanders, circles, triangles. Human and animal figures were highly stylized. In the Archaic period, black figure technique emerged. Artists painted figures in black silhouette on the red clay background, then incised details with a sharp tool. They depicted myths, daily life, athletic competitions, and battles. The red figure technique, developed in Athens around 530 BC, reversed this. The background was painted black, and figures were left in red, with details painted on rather than incised. This allowed for greater detail and more realistic depictions. Artists could show anatomy, drapery, and facial expressions more effectively. Pottery wasn't just decorative. It provides us with invaluable information about Greek life, beliefs, and values. Scenes on vases show us what clothing looked like, how people spent their time, what myths were popular, and how gods and heroes were imagined. Sculpture evolved from stiff, formal figures to dynamic, realistic representations. Archaic choroi, statues of young men, stood rigidly with arms at sides and 1 foot forward. They had stylized faces with the archaic smile, an expression that seems enigmatic to us. Choroi, statues of young women, wore elaborate drapery and often held offerings. In the classical period, sculptors mastered the depiction of the human body. They understood anatomy, proportion, and balance. They could show movement, weight, and emotion. Statues like the Doryphoros or Spear-bearer by Polykleitos exemplified ideal proportions. The sculptor had developed a mathematical system, the canon, for creating perfectly proportioned figures. Classical sculptures often depicted gods, heroes, and athletes. They celebrated physical perfection, beauty, and harmony. Many sculptures were made for temples or public spaces, celebrating the city's identity and values. Phidias, the greatest sculptor of the classical period, created the massive statue of Athena Parthenos for the Parthenon and the statue of Zeus at Olympia, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Both were chryselephantine, made of gold and ivory over a wooden frame. Neither survives today, but ancient descriptions tell of their awe-inspiring beauty. Relief sculptures decorated temples, showing scenes from mythology or history. The Parthenon's frieze depicted the Panathenaic procession, with hundreds of figures in a continuous band. The temple's pediments showed mythological scenes, including the birth of Athena and the contest between Athena and Poseidon for Athens. Hellenistic sculpture became more dramatic and emotional. Sculptors depicted a wider range of subjects: old people, children, foreigners, people in pain or ecstasy. The dying Gaul shows a wounded warrior in his final moments, noble even in defeat. The Laocoon group depicts the Trojan priest and his sons being killed by serpents, their faces contorted in agony. Greek architecture is best known for its temples, but Greeks also built theatres, stoas, covered walkways, gymnasiums, and other public buildings. The architectural orders, systems of proportions, and decorative elements were fundamental. The Doric order, the earliest and simplest, had sturdy columns with simple capitals. Doric temples, like the Parthenon, had a powerful masculine character. The Ionic order had more slender columns with scroll-shaped capitals, considered more elegant and feminine. The Corinthian order, developed later, had elaborate capitals decorated with acanthus leaves. Temples were built on a standardized plan. A rectangular building sat on a stepped platform. Columns surrounded the exterior, supporting the roof. Inside was the cellar, a chamber housing the cult statue. Temples faced east, so the rising sun would illuminate the statue. The Parthenon, built on the Athenian Acropolis between 447 and 432 BC, is the most famous Greek temple. It was designed by the architects Ictinus and Callicrates, with Phidias overseeing the sculpture. Every aspect was carefully planned. The columns lean slightly inward, the corner columns are thicker, and the horizontal lines curve subtly upward. These refinements correct optical illusions and create a sense of perfection. Greek theatres were built into hillsides, using the natural slope for seating. The theatre at Epidaurus, built in the 4th century BC, is famous for its acoustics. A person speaking in the orchestra, the circular performance space, can be heard clearly in the highest seats. Greek architecture influenced the Romans, who adopted and adapted Greek styles. Through Rome, Greek architectural principles spread across Europe and have influenced Western architecture ever since. Neoclassical buildings, from government buildings to museums to banks, draw on Greek models. Greek science and mathematics. Questioning the world. Greek thinkers made fundamental contributions to science and mathematics, asking questions about the natural world and developing methods to answer them. Early Greek philosophers, the Presocratics, sought natural explanations for phenomena rather than mythological ones. Thales of Miletus, in the 6th century BC, proposed that water was the fundamental substance of all things. Anaximander suggested an indefinite substance, the apeiron. Heraclitus argued that everything was in constant flux, that you couldn't step in the same river twice. Democritus proposed that everything was made of tiny, indivisible particles called atoms. These thinkers didn't have laboratories or sophisticated instruments, but they used reason and observation to develop theories. They established the principle that the natural world could be understood through human inquiry. Pythagoras, in the 6th century BC, founded a philosophical and religious movement that emphasized mathematics. The Pythagoreans discovered that musical intervals corresponded to simple numerical ratios. They believed that numbers were the fundamental reality, that everything could be explained mathematically. The Pythagorean theorem, that in a right triangle the square of the hypotenuse equals the sum of the squares of the other two sides, was known before Pythagoras, but he or his followers may have been the first to prove it mathematically. Hippocrates of Kos, in the 5th and 4th centuries BC, is considered the father of medicine. He established medicine as a profession distinct from philosophy and religion. The Hippocratic Corpus, a collection of medical texts, includes observations of diseases, treatments, and ethical guidelines. The Hippocratic Oath, though probably not written by Hippocrates, established ethical standards: do no harm, maintain patient confidentiality, and treat patients to the best of one's ability. Hippocratic medicine emphasized observation and natural causes. Diseases weren't punishments from gods, but resulted from imbalances in the body's humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Treatments included diet, rest, and sometimes drugs or surgery. Plato's Academy, founded around 387 BC, was a school where philosophy and mathematics were studied. Above its entrance, supposedly, were the words, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter." Plato believed that mathematics was key to understanding reality, that the physical world was an imperfect reflection of perfect mathematical forms. Aristotle, though he studied at the Academy, took a different approach. He emphasized empirical observation and categorization. He studied biology, dissecting animals and classifying species. He wrote on physics, arguing that objects move to their natural places, earth downward, fire upward. His physics, though later proven incorrect in many ways, dominated Western thought for centuries. In the Hellenistic period, science flourished, especially in Alexandria. Euclid's Elements, written around 300 BC, systematized geometry. It began with basic definitions and axioms, then logically derived theorems. It's one of the most influential textbooks ever written, used for over 2,000 years. Archimedes of Syracuse, in the 3rd century BC, was a brilliant mathematician and engineer. He calculated pi accurately, developed methods for finding areas and volumes, and discovered the principle of buoyancy. He invented war machines, including catapults, and a device called the Claw of Archimedes, which could lift enemy ships out of the water. He was killed by a Roman soldier during the siege of Syracuse, supposedly while working on a mathematical problem. Eratosthenes, in the 3rd century BC, calculated the circumference of the earth. He knew that at noon on the summer solstice, the sun was directly overhead in Syene, modern Aswan, casting no shadow. In Alexandria, at the same time, the sun cast a shadow at an angle of about 7 degrees. Knowing the distance between the cities, he calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy. Aristarchus of Samos proposed a heliocentric model, arguing that the Earth revolved around the Sun, not vice versa. This idea was rejected by most ancient astronomers, but would be revived in the Renaissance by Copernicus. Hipparchus, in the 2nd century BC, made precise astronomical observations, created a star catalogue, and discovered the precession of the equinoxes. He developed trigonometry to solve astronomical problems. Greek science was limited by the lack of precise instruments, the emphasis on theory over experiment, and certain philosophical assumptions. But Greek thinkers established the principle that the natural world was comprehensible, that human reason could uncover its laws. This legacy would inspire later scientists. Daily life in ancient Greece, the rhythms of existence. Beyond the famous battles, philosophers, and monuments, what was daily life like for ordinary Greeks? How did they spend their time? What did they eat, wear, believe, and feel? Most Greeks, throughout most of Greek history, were farmers. They lived in villages in the countryside surrounding cities. Their lives were shaped by the agricultural calendar, ploughing in autumn, planting grain in late autumn, tending crops in spring, harvesting in late spring and summer, and gathering grapes and olives in autumn. Farming in Greece was challenging. The soil was often rocky and poor. Rainfall was unreliable. The terrain was mountainous with limited flat land. Farmers grew wheat and barley for bread and porridge, olives for oil, and grapes for wine. They kept sheep and goats for milk, cheese, and wool. Chickens provided eggs. Pigs were kept, but less commonly than sheep and goats. A typical small farm might have a few acres, enough to support a family if the weather was good. Families would work together, men doing heavy labor like plowing, women and children helping with planting, weeding, and harvesting. During busy seasons, neighbors might help each other. Houses in the countryside were simple, built of mud brick on stone foundations. They had a few rooms, a living area, perhaps separate sleeping spaces, and storage for grain and equipment. Animals might be kept in a courtyard or in part of the house. Furniture was minimal: beds, stools, chests for storage. Food was simple, but adequate when harvests were good. Bread, usually made from barley, was the staple. It was coarse and heavy, not like modern bread. Porridge made from grain was also common. Olive oil was used for cooking as a spread and for lamps. Cheese, onions, garlic, and legumes like lentils and chickpeas added variety. Meat was a luxury for most people, eaten mainly at festivals when animals were sacrificed. Fish were more common for those living near the sea. Honey was the only sweetener. Fruit, when in season, was eaten fresh or dried. Figs were especially popular. Wine was the standard drink, but it was always mixed with water. Drinking unmixed wine was considered barbaric. Wine was part of social and religious life, consumed at symposia, festivals, and family meals. Clothing was simple. Men wore a chiton, a tunic made from a rectangle of cloth fastened at the shoulders and belted at the waist. Over this, they might wear a himation, a cloak draped over one shoulder. Women wore a peplos or chiton, often with a himation for warmth or modesty. Cloth was woven at home by women, usually from wool, sometimes from linen. Children helped with work from a young age. Boys might herd animals or help in the fields. Girls helped with household tasks, learning to spin, weave, cook, and manage a household. Education was not universal. In some cities, especially Athens, boys from well-off families went to school, learning to read, write, do mathematics, play music, and train athletically. Girls were generally educated at home, if at all. Life in cities was different. Cities were crowded, noisy, bustling places. Streets were narrow and often dirty. There was no systematic sanitation. Waste was thrown into streets or into cesspits. Diseases spread easily. Craftsmen and merchants lived in cities. Potters, smiths, carpenters, tanners, and other artisans worked in small workshops, often attached to their homes. They made goods for local use and for trade. Some became quite prosperous. Markets held in the Agora were centres of activity. People came to buy food, pottery, cloth, and other goods. They met friends, heard news, and discussed politics. Vendors shouted to attract customers, animals were sold, entertainers performed. Public buildings surrounded the Agora. Stowers provided shade and shelter, housing shops and offices. Council buildings and law courts were nearby. Temples reminded people of the gods' presence. Gymnasiums were places where men exercised, wrestled, and trained. They were also social centres where men discussed philosophy, politics, and other matters. Exercising nude was normal. The word gymnasium comes from the Greek word for naked. Baths, though not as elaborate as later Roman baths, were places to wash and socialize. Water had to be brought from wells or springs. Heating water was labor-intensive, so bathing wasn't daily for most people. Evenings might be spent at symposia, drinking parties for men. They would recline on couches, drink wine, eat snacks, talk, sing, and enjoy entertainment. Discussions ranged from philosophy to gossip. Hetairai, educated courtesans, might attend. These gatherings were important for social bonding and networking. Women's lives were more restricted, especially in Athens. Respectable women spent most of their time at home, managing households, supervising slaves, weaving, and caring for children. They rarely went out except for religious festivals or family events. When they did go out, they were veiled and accompanied. However, women in other cities, like Sparta, had more freedom. Spartan women could own property, were educated, and were expected to maintain physical fitness. In rural areas, women's work outside the home was more common and accepted. Marriage was primarily about creating alliances and producing legitimate children. Marriages were arranged by families. Girls were often married in their mid-teens to men in their 20s or 30s. Love might develop, but it wasn't the primary basis for marriage. Childbirth was dangerous. Many women died in childbirth, and infant mortality was high. Families might have many children, but not all would survive to adulthood. Children who did survive were cherished, though practices like exposure of unwanted infants, while disturbing to us, occurred. Slavery was ubiquitous. Slaves might be prisoners of war, children of slaves, or people sold by pirates or slave traders. They worked as household servants, farmhands, craftsmen, or labourers. In Athens, some slaves worked in the dangerous silver mines at Laurion under brutal conditions. The treatment of slaves varied widely. Some household slaves were treated relatively well, almost as part of the family. They might be freed, especially if they'd served loyally for years. Others were treated harshly. Legally, slaves had few rights and could be punished, sold, or killed by their owners. Old age, for those who reached it, was respected. Elders were honoured for their wisdom and experience. They might advise younger people, participate in governance, and enjoy the fruits of their earlier labours. But old age could also bring poverty and dependence if one had no family or resources. Death was a significant event. Funeral rituals were important, ensuring the deceased could rest peacefully. Bodies were washed, anointed, and dressed. They might be cremated or buried. Grave goods, including pottery, jewelry, and personal items, were placed with the dead. Mourning periods were observed, with family members wearing dark clothing and abstaining from festive activities. Greeks believed that the soul survived death, descending to the underworld ruled by Hades. Most souls existed as shades in a dim, joyless realm. Only a few, the truly wicked, suffered in Tartarus, or the heroic enjoyed the Elysian fields. Mystery religions promised initiates a better afterlife, which attracted many followers. Life was precarious. War, disease, crop failure, and natural disasters were constant threats. But there were also joys, festivals, marriages, the birth of children, good harvests, victories, friendships, love. Greeks celebrated life, honoured the gods, and tried to live with honour and dignity. The Greek legacy influences that endure. The story of ancient Greece is not just about the past. Greek ideas, values, and achievements have shaped Western civilization and continue to influence the world today. Democracy, though practiced differently now, has its roots in ancient Athens. The idea that citizens should have a say in how they're governed, that leaders should be accountable, that laws should apply equally, comes from the Greek experience. Modern democratic institutions, from parliaments to courts to elections, owe a debt to Greek innovations. Philosophy, the love of wisdom, was born in Greece. Greek philosophers asked fundamental questions. What is real? How do we know? What is good? How should we live? Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle established methods of inquiry, modes of argumentation, and frameworks of thought that remain influential. Modern philosophy, science, and even theology engage with Greek ideas. Science and mathematics were transformed by Greek thinkers. The idea that nature operates according to laws that can be discovered through reason and observation, that mathematics can describe reality, that hypotheses can be tested, all come from the Greeks. Euclid's geometry, Hippocratic medicine, Aristotelian logic, these were foundations upon which later thinkers built. Literature owes much to Greece. Epic poetry, tragedy, comedy, lyric poetry, history, these genres were developed or refined by Greek writers. Homer's epics influenced countless later works. Greek tragedies explored human nature in ways that still resonate. The structure of drama, with acts, characters, and dramatic tension, comes from Greece. Art and architecture have been influenced by Greek models for centuries. Renaissance artists studied Greek sculptures to understand anatomy and proportion. Neoclassical architects designed buildings based on Greek temples. Museums worldwide house Greek art, and new generations of artists continue to be inspired by Greek aesthetics. The Olympic Games, revived in modern form in 1896, recall the ancient Greek tradition of athletic competition and international gathering. The ideal of physical excellence, of fair competition, of bringing people together through sport, echoes Greek values. Greek mythology remains part of our cultural vocabulary. We speak of Achilles' heels, Pandora's boxes, Oedipal complexes, and Sisyphean tasks. Stories of gods and heroes are retold in books, movies, and art. They explore themes, archetypes, desires, and fears that are timeless. Even our language is full of Greek. Words like democracy, philosophy, mathematics, physics, theatre, politics, ethics, and countless others come from Greek. Scientific and medical terminology is often derived from Greek roots. But the Greek legacy isn't just about specific ideas or inventions. It's about an approach to life, valuing reason and inquiry, celebrating human achievement, seeking balance and harmony, engaging with the world thoughtfully and critically. It's about the belief that humans can understand their world, improve their societies, and create beauty and meaning. Of course, ancient Greece also had flaws. Slavery, the subordination of women, warfare, and imperialism were part of Greek society. We shouldn't romanticize or idealize the Greeks, but we can recognize their achievements and learn from both their successes and failures. The story of ancient Greece is a story of people trying to build good lives, to understand their world, to create communities, and to leave something valuable for those who came after. In that, they succeeded remarkably, Their legacy, complex and multifaceted, continues to enrich our world. Conclusion. Reflections on a distant time. As we come to the end of our journey through ancient Greece, it's worth pausing to reflect on what we've explored. We've travelled from the dim beginnings of Greek civilization, through the glories of the classical period, to the conquests of Alexander and the complexities of the Hellenistic world. We've seen the rise and fall of empires, the birth of democracy, the creation of timeless art and literature, and the daily struggles and joys of ordinary people. Ancient Greece was not a single, unified nation, but a collection of city-states, each with its own character, each contributing to the rich tapestry of Greek culture. From Athens' democracy to Sparta's militarism, from the trading cities of Ionia to the colonies of Magna Graecia, Greeks explored different ways of organizing society and living meaningful lives. They were people like us, with hopes and fears, ambitions and limitations. They loved and fought, created and destroyed, questioned and believed. They built cities and temples, wrote poems and plays, developed philosophies and sciences. They left behind a legacy that has shaped the world in profound ways. Understanding ancient Greece helps us understand ourselves. Many of our ideas about democracy, justice, beauty, and knowledge have Greek roots. Many of our stories, our ways of thinking, our values, can be traced back to this remarkable civilization. But more than that, studying ancient Greece reminds us of human potential. It shows us what people can achieve when they value creativity, inquiry, and excellence. It also reminds us of human frailty, of how even great civilizations can fall, how injustice can coexist with achievement, how we must constantly strive to do better. As you drift off to sleep, perhaps you'll dream of marble temples gleaming in the Mediterranean sun, of philosophers debating in the Agora, of athletes competing at Olympia, of ships sailing across wine-dark seas. Perhaps you'll hear echoes of Homer's poetry, the choruses of Greek tragedy, the laughter at a symposium. The ancient Greeks are gone, their cities in ruins, their language changed, but their spirit, their curiosity, their love of beauty and wisdom remains. It lives in every democratic vote, every scientific discovery, every philosophical question, every work of art that strives for excellence. Greek warfare, the art of battle. To truly understand ancient Greece, we must explore how Greeks fought their wars, for warfare shaped their societies, their values, and their histories. From the hoplite phalanx to the trireme warships, Greek military innovations were as influential as their philosophy and art. The hoplite, the heavily armed infantry soldier, was the backbone of Greek armies from the 7th century BC onward. The word hoplite comes from hoplon, the large round shield each soldier carried. This shield, about 3 feet in diameter, was made of wood covered with bronze, with a leather strap for the forearm and a grip for the hand. A hoplite's armour was expensive, which meant that only those with some wealth could afford to be hoplites. This created a link between military service and political participation. Those who could afford hoplite armour, the middle class, formed the core of the citizen body in many cities. The hoplite panoply, the complete set of armour, included a bronze breastplate or a linothorax, armour made of layers of linen glued together. Bronze greaves protected the shins. A bronze helmet, usually Corinthian style with cheek guards and a nose guard, protected the head. The hoplite carried a long spear, about 8 feet long, and a short sword for close combat. Hoplites fought in a formation called the phalanx. They stood in ranks, usually 8 men deep, shoulder to shoulder, shields overlapping. The front rank would present a wall of shields and spear points. The ranks behind would push forward, adding weight and replacing fallen front rank fighters. The phalanx was incredibly strong from the front, but vulnerable on the flanks and rear. Battles between phalanxes were pushing matches, each side trying to break the other's formation. Once one side broke and ran, the battle was essentially over. Pursuit and slaughter of fleeing enemies was common, though sometimes a defeated army could retreat in good order. Hoplite warfare was ritualized in some ways. Battles were often fought by mutual agreement on level ground during the campaigning season. After a battle, the victors would erect a trophy, a monument made of captured arms and armor. The defeated would ask permission to collect their dead, an acknowledgement of defeat. But warfare could also be brutal and total. Cities under siege might be starved into submission or stormed. Populations could be massacred or enslaved. The rules of war, such as they were, didn't always apply, especially when Greeks fought non-Greeks or when passions ran high. Athens' strength was its navy. After the Persian Wars, Athens built a fleet of triremes, warships powered by 3 banks of oars on each side. A trireme had a crew of about 200, most of them rowers. It was fast and maneuverable, designed to ram enemy ships or break their oars. Naval battles required skill and coordination. Triremes would try to ram enemy ships below the waterline, sinking them. They might also come alongside and allow marines to board and fight. The Battle of Salamis, where the Greeks defeated the Persian fleet, was won through superior tactics and seamanship in confined waters. Athens paid its rowers, which meant that even poor citizens could serve and contribute to the city's defense. This gave poorer citizens political leverage, and was one reason Athens developed a more radical democracy than other cities. Sparta's military was unique. Spartan boys entered military training at age 7, living in barracks and undergoing harsh discipline. They learned to fight, to endure hardship, and to obey orders without question. Spartan men remained in military service until age 60. They lived simply, eating communal meals, training constantly, always ready for war. The Spartan phalanx was considered the best in Greece. Spartans trained together from childhood, knew each other intimately, and fought with discipline and coordination. Their red cloaks, long hair, and reputation made them feared opponents. At Thermopylae, 300 Spartans held off a vastly larger Persian force, showing the effectiveness of Spartan training and determination. Spartan women were expected to be strong and healthy, producing robust children. They managed estates while men were away or in barracks. There's a story of a Spartan mother who, when told her son died in battle, asked if Sparta won. When told it had, she said that was all that mattered. Whether true or not, such stories illustrate Spartan values, duty, sacrifice, and the subordination of individual to state. Siege warfare developed over time. Early sieges were simple blockades, starving cities into submission. Later, engineers developed siege towers, battering rams, and catapults. Alexander the Great's siege of Tyre, where he built a causeway to reach the island city, showed sophisticated engineering. Greek mercenaries became common in the 4th century BC. As warfare became more frequent and prolonged, professional soldiers who fought for pay emerged. The 10,000 Greek mercenaries who fought for a Persian prince and then had to march back through hostile territory showed the skill and resilience of Greek soldiers. Their story, told by Xenophon in the Anabasis, is a gripping tale of survival and leadership. Cavalry was less important in Greece than in other places. The mountainous terrain didn't favour cavalry, and horses were expensive. Thessaly, with its plains, was an exception and provided the best Greek cavalry. Alexander the Great's companion cavalry, drawn from Macedonian nobility, was an elite force that played crucial roles in his victories. Light infantry, such as peltasts armed with javelins and small shields, could harass hoplites and were effective in rough terrain. At the Battle of Lechaeum in 390 BC, Athenian peltasts defeated Spartan hoplites by staying out of reach and pelting them with javelins, showing that the hoplite phalanx wasn't invincible. The Macedonian phalanx, developed by Philip II, was different from the traditional Greek phalanx. Macedonian soldiers, called phalangites, carried the sarissa, a pike up to 18 feet long. The first 5 ranks could present their pikes forward, creating a bristling wall of spear points. The Macedonian phalanx was less flexible than the hoplite phalanx, but had greater reach and striking power. Alexander combined the phalanx with heavy cavalry, light infantry, and archers, creating a combined arms force that could adapt to different situations. His battles were masterpieces of tactical coordination. At Gaugamela, he used his phalanx to fix the Persian centre while he led his cavalry in a decisive charge that broke through and routed the enemy. Greek warfare was not just about fighting, it was about honour, courage, and civic duty. To die in battle for one's city was considered noble. Cowardice was shameful, and cowards could be disenfranchised or shamed publicly. Funerals for fallen soldiers were civic events, with orations praising their sacrifice. Yet warfare also brought suffering. Families lost fathers, sons, and brothers. Cities were destroyed, crops burned, populations displaced. The Peloponnesian War, lasting a generation, devastated Greece and left deep scars. Thucydides' history of that war shows not just battles, but the human cost, the moral decay, the brutality that war can bring. Women in ancient Greece lives behind the veil. When we speak of ancient Greece, we often speak of men, philosophers, generals, politicians, artists. But what about the women? Their lives were constrained by the patriarchal societies they lived in, but they were not invisible. They had roles, experiences, and occasionally voices that have come down to us. Women's lives varied significantly depending on the city, state, social class, and time period. In Athens, women of citizen families were quite restricted. They spent most of their time in the gynaeconitis, the women's quarters of the house. They managed households, supervised slaves, and raised children. They spun wool and wove cloth, activities so associated with women that the spindle and loom were symbols of femininity. Young Athenian girls were raised at home, learning domestic skills from their mothers. They received little formal education, though some might learn to read and write. They married young, often in their mid-teens, to men in their 20s or 30s, Marriage was arranged by the girl's father and the prospective husband. The bride brought a dowry, which remained hers in case of divorce. The wedding involved rituals and ceremonies. There would be sacrifices, a feast, and a procession taking the bride from her father's house to her husband's. The bride would be veiled, carried in a cart, accompanied by torches and music. At her new home, she would be introduced to her husband's hearth and household gods. In marriage, a woman's primary duty was to produce legitimate children, especially sons, to inherit property and continue the family line. Women managed the household, controlling the stores, organizing work, and ensuring everything ran smoothly. In wealthy households, they supervised slaves. In poorer ones, they did the work themselves. Women's movements outside the home were limited. They could attend religious festivals, which were important social occasions. Some festivals, like the Thesmophoria, were exclusively for women. They would gather, perform rituals for Demeter, and spend time away from male supervision. These festivals gave women a rare opportunity for socializing and bonding. Funerals were also occasions when women appeared in public. Women would prepare the body, wash and dress it, and lead the mourning. They would wail, tear their hair, and wear dark clothing. At the funeral, they would walk in procession to the burial site. Otherwise, Athenian women of respectable families stayed home. If they went out, they were veiled and accompanied by slaves or relatives. They didn't participate in politics, couldn't own property except their dowry, and had no legal standing. In court, they couldn't testify or represent themselves. A male relative spoke for them. Yet women found ways to exercise influence. They managed households, which gave them economic power. They raised sons and influenced their values. Some women, like Aspasia, the partner of Pericles, were known for their intelligence and participated in intellectual circles, though Aspasia was a foreigner, not a citizen's wife, which gave her more freedom. Spartan women had more freedom and responsibility than Athenian women. Sparta's militaristic society required men to focus on warfare, so women managed estates, made economic decisions, and had more independence. Spartan girls exercised, participating in athletics to ensure they'd be strong and healthy mothers. Spartan women could own property, which many did. By the 4th century BC, women controlled a significant portion of Sparta's land. They had a reputation for outspokenness and confidence. When a foreign woman told a Spartan woman, "You Spartan women are the only ones who rule men," the Spartan replied, "We're the only ones who give birth to men." In other city-states, women's experiences varied. In some places, women participated more in public religious life. In Macedon, royal women wielded significant power. Olympias, Alexander the Great's mother, was a formidable political figure who fought to protect her sons' and grandsons' interests after Alexander's death. Hetairae, courtesans, were another category of women. Unlike wives, Hetairae were often educated, able to converse on philosophy, politics, and art. They attended symposia, places respectable wives couldn't go. Some became wealthy and influential. Aspasia, Pericles' companion, was likely a hetera. She was known for her wit and intelligence, and Socrates supposedly admired her conversation. Women in lower classes had different experiences. Poor women worked outside the home out of necessity. They sold goods in the market, worked in fields, served as midwives or wet nurses. They had less time for leisure and fewer restrictions on movement, simply because their labour was needed. Slavery affected women's lives significantly. Female slaves worked as household servants, cooks, nurses, and companions. Some were skilled in crafts. The relationship between mistress and slave could vary from harsh to relatively kind. Slaves had no rights and could be abused, though harshly treating slaves was sometimes discouraged as bad management. Women appear in Greek literature, though usually written by men. In Homer's epics, Penelope, Odysseus's wife, is portrayed as faithful, clever, and resourceful, holding off suitors for years while waiting for her husband. Helen of Troy is beautiful and somewhat mysterious, her agency in the Trojan War ambiguous. Greek tragedy often featured strong, complex female characters. Medea, in Euripides' play, is a woman wronged by her husband who takes terrible revenge. Antigone, in Sophocles' play, defies a king to honour her brother, choosing moral duty over law. Clytemnestra kills her husband Agamemnon to avenge his sacrifice of their daughter. These characters are powerful, intelligent, and complex, though they often come to tragic ends. Comedy portrayed women differently, often as shrewd and cunning. In Aristophanes' Lysistrata, women from different city-states band together to end the Peloponnesian War by refusing sex with their husbands until peace is made. The play is a comedy, full of crude humour, but it gives women agency and shows them as capable of influencing events. Poetry by women has survived, most notably from Sappho, a poet from Lesbos who lived around 600 BC. Her poems, many fragmentary, speak of love, beauty, desire, and personal feeling. She wrote about her emotions with a directness and intensity that was unusual. Her work shows that women, when they had the opportunity, could create art as powerful as any man's. Priestesses held important religious positions. The Pythia at Delphi was the most famous, serving as Apollo's oracle. Her prophecies influenced major political and military decisions. Other priestesses served various gods and goddesses, performing rituals, maintaining temples, and presiding over festivals. Religious roles gave women public visibility and authority. Philosophers occasionally discussed women's nature and roles. Plato, in the Republic, suggested that in an ideal state, women could serve as guardians alongside men, receiving the same education and training. This was a radical idea, though Plato didn't necessarily advocate for it in the real world. Aristotle, more conventionally, argued that women were naturally inferior to men, lacking full rationality and suited only for domestic roles. Women's lives in ancient Greece were constrained by their society's patriarchal structures. They had fewer rights, less freedom, and fewer opportunities than men. But they were not simply passive victims. They managed households, raised children, participated in religious life, formed relationships, and found ways to exercise influence. Their experiences, though often hidden in the historical record, were part of the rich tapestry of Greek life. Greek trade and economy, the flow of goods. Ancient Greece's economy was based primarily on agriculture, but trade played a crucial role, connecting Greek cities with each other and with the wider Mediterranean world. Understanding Greek trade helps us understand how cities grew wealthy, how ideas spread, and how Greeks interacted with other cultures. Agriculture was the foundation. Most people worked the land, growing crops and raising animals, but Greece's geography presented challenges. Arable land was limited, mountains divided regions, and soil was often poor. This meant that many cities couldn't produce enough food to feed their populations. Athens, in particular, depended on imported grain. The city had a large population but limited agricultural land. It imported wheat from the Black Sea region, from Egypt, and from Sicily. These grain imports were so vital that Athens maintained a strong navy, partly to protect the sea routes. Disrupting Athens' grain supply was a strategy enemies used during the Peloponnesian War. Olive oil and wine were major exports. Greece's climate was ideal for olives and grapes. Farmers would harvest olives in autumn, pressing them to extract oil. Wine was made from grapes, fermented in large jars called amphorae. Both products were exported throughout the Mediterranean. Pottery was another significant export. Greek pottery, especially from Athens and Corinth, was prized for its quality and beauty. Potters created vessels for various purposes: amphorae for storage and transport, craters for mixing wine, kylix for drinking, and lekithoi for oils. These vessels, decorated with intricate designs and scenes, were traded widely. Silver from the mines at Laurion, near Athens, was another valuable resource. The mines produced large quantities of silver, which Athens minted into coins. Silver was used for trade, to pay for imports, to finance building projects, and to pay soldiers and sailors. The wealth from Laurion helped make Athens powerful. Metals were generally imported. Greece had some copper and iron deposits, but not enough for its needs. Bronze, essential for weapons and tools, required copper and tin. Tin was rare and had to be imported from distant sources, possibly from Spain or Britain. This made bronze expensive and increased the value of skilled smiths. Trade routes crisscrossed the Mediterranean and Black Seas. Greek ships sailed from port to port, carrying goods and passengers. These ships were mostly merchant vessels, broad and sturdy, powered by sails. They hugged coastlines when possible, sheltering in harbours at night, avoiding sailing in winter when storms were common. Ports were bustling places. Merchants would unload goods, pay customs duties, and sell their cargoes. Shipowners might hire agents to handle transactions. Warehouses stored goods until they could be sold or transported inland. Markets near ports offered goods from across the known world. Coins facilitated trade. Before coins, trade was often by barter, exchanging goods directly. Coins, standardized pieces of metal stamped with official marks, made transactions easier. Different cities minted their own coins, usually silver, with designs representing the city. Athenian coins featured an owl, symbol of Athena. Banking developed to support trade. Bankers, often foreigners called metics in Athens, would change money, provide loans, and hold deposits. They charged interest on loans, which could be quite high, especially for risky ventures like maritime trade. Maritime loans were common, where lenders provided capital for a voyage and were repaid with interest if the ship returned safely. If the ship sank, the lender lost their investment. Markets, held in the Agora, were where locals bought daily necessities. Farmers brought produce, craftsmen sold their goods, and merchants offered imported items. Markets were regulated to some extent. Officials checked weights and measures to prevent fraud. Prices fluctuated based on supply and demand. Taxation, supported city-states. Athens collected taxes on imports and exports. Citizens paid a property tax, the eisphora, during wartime. Metics paid a residence tax. There were also liturgies, where wealthy citizens were expected to finance public services like festivals, choruses for plays, or warships. This was both a tax and a source of honor. Slavery was integral to the economy. Slaves worked in households, on farms, in workshops, and in mines. The silver mines at Laurion used slave labor under harsh conditions. Slaves had no wages, so they were a cost-effective labor source, though they had to be fed, clothed, and sheltered. Some slaves were skilled craftsmen, earning money for their masters, and sometimes saving to buy their freedom. Metics, foreign residents in cities like Athens, played important roles in the economy. They couldn't own land or participate in politics, but they could engage in trade and crafts. Many successful merchants, bankers, and craftsmen were metics. They contributed to the city's prosperity and paid taxes, but remained outside the citizen body. Trade brought wealth, but also cultural exchange. Greeks encountered Egyptians, Phoenicians, Persians, and others. They saw different customs, technologies, and ideas. They adopted elements from other cultures, adapting them to Greek contexts. The alphabet came from the Phoenicians. Certain artistic motifs were influenced by Near Eastern art. The cult of the goddess Cybele came from Anatolia. Greeks established colonies partly for trade. Colonies could produce goods, like grain from the Black Sea or metals from Spain, and send them back to the mother city. They also served as markets for Greek goods. The relationship between colony and mother city was usually friendly, with economic and cultural ties, though colonies were politically independent. Piracy was a constant threat. Pirates attacked merchant ships, stealing cargoes and capturing people to sell as slaves. Some regions, like Cilicia in southern Anatolia, were notorious pirate havens. Cities and kingdoms tried to suppress piracy with varying success. Merchants travelled in groups for safety and avoided certain routes. Economic inequality existed. Wealthy landowners and successful merchants lived comfortably, owning slaves, fine houses, and luxury goods. Poor citizens might struggle to feed their families, working as labourers or small-scale farmers. In times of hardship, such as war or crop failure, the poor suffered most. Social tensions between rich and poor could lead to political upheaval. The economy wasn't static. It grew and changed over time. The expansion of trade in the Archaic period contributed to the rise of city-states and the development of coinage. The wealth of the classical period supported cultural achievements. The Hellenistic period saw even more extensive trade networks, connecting the Mediterranean with India and beyond. Understanding the economy helps us see ancient Greece not just as a place of philosophers and warriors, but as a complex society where people worked, traded, and struggled to make livings. The flow of goods, the clinking of coins, the bustle of markets, these were as much a part of Greek life as debates in the Agora or performances in the theatre. Greek education and childhood, growing up Greek. What was it like to be a child in ancient Greece? How were children raised, educated, and prepared for adult life? The answers varied depending on the city, state, social class, and gender, but we can piece together a picture from the sources we have. Greek childhood began with birth. which was a dangerous time for both mother and child. Infant mortality was high. Perhaps 25 to 33% of babies died in their first year. Childbirth was risky for mothers too, and many women died giving birth. When a baby was born, the father decided whether to keep it. If the baby was weak, deformed, or if the family couldn't afford another child, the father might choose exposure, leaving the baby outside to die. This practice, horrifying to us, was legal and not uncommon. Girls were more likely to be exposed than boys, as sons were more valued. Some exposed infants might be rescued and raised as slaves. If the baby was accepted, there would be a naming ceremony on the 7th or 10th day after birth. The family would celebrate with sacrifices and gifts. The baby would be named, often after a grandparent. Naming connected the child to the family and ancestors. Infants were cared for by mothers and female slaves. They were nursed, sometimes by wet nurses if the mother couldn't or chose not to. Babies were swaddled, wrapped snugly in cloth, which was believed to help them grow straight. They would be sung lullabies, rocked, and comforted. Childhood was recognized as a distinct phase of life. Children wore different clothing than adults, usually simple tunics. Boys wore their hair long until adolescence. Children played with toys, dolls, miniature animals, balls, hoops, knucklebones, a game like jacks. They played games, many of which are still played today, like hide and seek and tug of war. Religious festivals marked stages of childhood. In Athens, at age 3 or 4, children participated in the Anthesteria, a festival for Dionysus, receiving small jugs of wine. At various ages, children might participate in processions or rituals, gradually being integrated into the community. Education varied greatly. In Sparta, boys were taken from their families at age 7 and entered the Agora, the rigorous state education system. They lived in barracks, trained in athletics and warfare, learned discipline and obedience. They were deliberately underfed to encourage stealing food, which taught resourcefulness and stealth. If caught, they were punished not for stealing, but for being caught. Spartan education was harsh. Boys fought each other, endured beatings, and were taught to endure pain without complaint. The goal was to create disciplined, tough warriors. Education in reading and writing was minimal. Physical training and military skills were paramount. At age 20, if they passed their final tests, they became full citizens and soldiers. Spartan girls also received physical education, unusual in Greece. They trained in athletics, running, wrestling, and throwing the javelin. The goal was to produce strong, healthy mothers who would bear healthy children. Spartan women were famous for their physical fitness and outspokenness. In Athens, education was very different and depended on social class. Wealthy families could afford to educate their sons. Boys from such families would be accompanied to school by a slave called a pedagogos, who supervised and protected them. Athenian education had several components. Boys learned to read and write, studying works of Homer and other poets. They learned to play the lyre and to sing. They studied mathematics, learning arithmetic and geometry. Physical education was important. Boys trained at a gymnasium, learning wrestling, running, jumping, and throwing the javelin and discus. The goal of Athenian education was to produce well-rounded citizens, capable in mind and body, who could participate in civic life. Rhetoric, the art of speaking persuasively, was particularly valued, as success in democratic Athens often depended on one's ability to argue effectively in the assembly or law courts. At around age 18, Athenian young men might serve as ephebes, undergoing 2 years of military training. They would learn to fight as hoplites, serve on patrol duty, and swear oaths to defend the city. After completing their ephebic service, they became full citizens with the right to participate in the assembly. Girls in Athens received little formal education. They were taught at home by their mothers, learning domestic skills, spinning, weaving, cooking, managing a household. Some might learn to read and write, but this wasn't considered essential. The goal was to prepare them to be wives and mothers. In poorer families, children received no formal education. Boys learned their father's trade, working alongside him from a young age. Girls helped their mothers with domestic work. For these families, survival was the priority, and education was a luxury they couldn't afford. Childhood ended at different ages for boys and girls. Girls married young, often in their mid-teens, transitioning directly from childhood to being wives. Boys went through a longer transition. After their education and military training, they gradually took on adult responsibilities. Coming-of-age rituals marked transitions. In Athens, boys at age 16 or 17 were enrolled in their father's phratry, a kinship group, and registered in their deme, a local administrative unit. This made them citizens, though full political rights came later. Girls' main coming-of-age ritual was marriage, which transferred them from their father's authority to their husbands. Children were important to Greek families. They ensured the continuation of the family line, would care for aging parents, and would perform funeral rites. Sons inherited property and maintained the family's social status. This made having sons crucial, and families without sons might adopt. Yet childhood was also dangerous. Disease, accidents, and malnutrition claimed many young lives. Parents who survived to old age might have buried several children. This doesn't mean parents didn't love their children. Ancient sources show that parents grieved deeply for lost children, but they also knew that death was a common part of life. Stories and myths were part of childhood. Children heard tales of gods and heroes from nurses, parents, and teachers. These stories entertained, but also taught values, cautionary lessons, and cultural knowledge. Heroes like Pericles and Theseus were models of courage and strength. God's stories explained natural phenomena and moral lessons. Discipline in childhood could be harsh by modern standards. Physical punishment was common and accepted. Teachers could beat students, parents could beat children, and slave pedagogoi could enforce discipline with a stick. Obedience and respect for authority were emphasized. Yet there was also affection and joy. Vase paintings show parents playing with children, holding babies, teaching them to walk. Grave markers for children show grief and love, with inscriptions mourning lives cut short. Children were valued, cherished, and mourned. Growing up in ancient Greece meant learning your place in society. For boys from citizen families, it meant preparing to be citizens, soldiers, and heads of households. For girls, it meant preparing to be wives and mothers. For slaves and non-citizens, it meant learning to navigate a society where they had limited rights, but still carved out lives and identities. Greek music and dance, the rhythms of life. Music and dance were integral to ancient Greek life, accompanying religious rituals, theatrical performances, symposia, and everyday activities. Though we can't hear ancient Greek music, we can understand its importance and some of its characteristics. Music in Greece was closely tied to poetry. The word lyric poetry comes from the lyre, a stringed instrument. Poems were meant to be sung or chanted, accompanied by music. This wasn't entertainment in the background. Music and poetry were inseparable arts. The lyre was the most iconic Greek instrument. It had a sound box, usually made from a tortoise shell, with arms extending upward and a crossbar. Strings, originally made from animal gut, were stretched between the crossbar and the sound box. Players plucked the strings with a plectrum or their fingers. The kithara was a larger, more professional version of the lyre, with a wooden sound box. Professional musicians, called kitharodes, performed on the kithara, singing and accompanying themselves. Competitions for kitharodes were held at festivals, and skilled performers were celebrated. The aulos was a reed instrument, somewhat like an oboe, though often mistranslated as a flute. It had a double reed and produced a loud, penetrating sound. Aulos players often played two pipes simultaneously, one in each hand, called the double aulos. The aulos was associated with Dionysus and was used in ecstatic, emotional music. Percussion instruments included drums, tambourines, and cymbals. These were used in religious processions and dances, especially those associated with Dionysus and other ecstatic cults. Greek music theory was sophisticated. Pythagoras and his followers discovered that musical intervals corresponded to mathematical ratios. An octave was a 2-to-1 ratio, a fifth was 3-to-2, and a fourth was 4-to-3. This revealed a deep connection between mathematics and music, between number and harmony. Greeks used modes, scales with different patterns of intervals, each associated with different moods and effects. The Dorian mode was considered solemn and martial. The Phrygian mode was ecstatic and emotional. The Lydian mode was soft and mournful. These modes shaped the character of music, and philosophers debated their ethical effects. Plato, in the Republic, discussed music's influence on character. He believed certain modes and rhythms could make people brave, disciplined, and virtuous, while others could make them weak or licentious. He advocated for censorship of music, allowing only modes that promoted good character. This shows how seriously Greeks took music's power. Music accompanied poetry at symposia. Men would recline on couches, drinking wine, and taking turns singing poems, often accompanied by the lyre. Singing well was a mark of education and culture. The poems might be love songs, drinking songs, or political verses. Theatre relied heavily on music. In tragedies, the chorus would sing and dance, their performances integral to the play. The music heightened emotional impact, underscored themes, and provided commentary. The meters and rhythms of tragic poetry were musical, meant to be chanted or sung. Comedy also used music, though often in parodic or humorous ways. Comic choruses might sing ridiculous songs, dance absurdly, and provide entertainment along with satire. Dance was inseparable from music. Religious processions included dances, with participants moving rhythmically to music. The most famous religious dance was the tragic chorus's performance in theatre, which was highly stylized with prescribed movements and formations. Different dances had different characters. The Pyrrhic dance was a war dance performed by armed men moving in formation, simulating battle. It trained young men for warfare while honouring Athena or Ares. The Gymnopedia in Sparta was a dance performed by naked boys, celebrating strength and discipline. Women danced at festivals, especially those for Demeter, Dionysus, and Artemis. These dances could be joyful, solemn, or ecstatic. The Mænads, female followers of Dionysus, were said to dance wildly in the mountains, entering frenzied states, though how much of this is myth and how much reality is unclear. Social dances occurred at weddings, festivals, and celebrations. People would dance in circles or lines, holding hands, moving to music. These dances fostered community, bringing people together in shared physical expression. Professional dancers, usually slaves or foreigners, performed at symposia and other events. They might dance solo, displaying skill and grace, sometimes erotically. This was entertainment, distinct from the communal religious dances. Music and dance education were part of cultivating a well-rounded person. Boys learned to play the lyre and to sing. They participated in choruses, learning to move and sing together. This taught rhythm, harmony, and the ability to work as part of a group. Competitions in music and dance were held at major festivals. The Pythian Games at Delphi, held every 4 years, included musical competitions alongside athletic ones. Winners received laurel wreaths and great prestige. These competitions showcased skill and offered opportunities for recognition. Though we have some ancient Greek musical notation, deciphering it is difficult, and what we can reconstruct is fragmentary. We don't truly know what Greek music sounded like, but we know it was central to their lives, that it moved them, expressed their feelings, and connected them to the divine. Music was a language of emotions and ideas. It could inspire courage in soldiers marching to battle, evoke mourning at funerals, create joy at festivals, and deepen religious experience. It was art, but it was also functional, woven into the fabric of daily life in ways we can only imagine. Final thoughts. The echoes of Greece. As we near the end of our long journey through ancient Greece, it's worth reflecting on the threads that connect this distant civilization to our own lives. Thousands of years separate us from the Greeks, yet their influence remains present in countless ways. The Greeks asked questions that we still ask. What is justice? How should we live? What can we know? What is beauty? Their answers weren't always the same as ours, but their willingness to question, to think critically, to seek understanding through reason, established an intellectual tradition that continues. Democracy, with all its flaws and limitations in ancient Athens, represented a radical idea that ordinary people could govern themselves, that political power didn't have to be concentrated in the hands of kings or aristocrats. That idea, expanded and reformed over centuries, underpins modern democratic societies. Greek art established principles of beauty, proportion, and harmony that have influenced countless artists. The human figure, realistically rendered yet idealized, became a subject of endless fascination. Architecture based on rational principles, where every element has purpose and meaning, became a model. Thank you all for joining me tonight. This has been Sleepless History. Good night.